My name is Adana Cooper. I was 31 years old the evening my mother-in-law handed me a formal invoice to live in a house I bought with my own cash. It was a Tuesday. I had just finished serving dinner in the kitchen of my 5-bedroom home in coastal Georgia, a home I secured with a $90,000 down payment 2 years before I ever met my husband, Leo. We were sitting at the quartz island. Valerie, Leo's mother, reached into the pocket of her tailored slacks. She pulled out a folded slip of paper, smoothed the creases flat with her thumbs, and slid it across the marble toward me. $1,000. That was the number printed in crisp black ink next to the words, monthly household rent. Sitting across from her was Natalie, Leo's sister, picking at her salad with a faint, satisfied smirk. I looked at the paper. Then I looked at Leo, waiting for him to intercept what had to be an absurd joke. My husband did not laugh. He did not look surprised. He swirled his wine, shrugged his shoulders, and delivered the sentence that ended our marriage. My money is mine, Idana, and yours is yours. With everyone living here, it is only fair you contribute to the house. He sat in a dining room I furnished, under a roof I paid $3,000 a month to keep over his head, and told me to contribute. The audacity was breathtaking, but the rent bill was just a distraction, a petty magic trick designed to make me look the wrong way. The true betrayal was a 6-figure theft, quietly bleeding my equity dry, orchestrated by the man sharing my bed, and stamped with a corrupt seal. Welcome to Cutie Told Stories, where women who are pushed to the edge stop crying and start auditing. If a partner has ever used your own generosity against you, tell me your age in the comments and let me know where you are listening from. I want you to picture that kitchen. The stainless steel appliances gleaming under the pendant lights, the imported tile I chose by hand. Everything around us belonged to me on paper, yet I was being treated like a tenant who had fallen behind on her dues. If you have ever felt like a stranger in your own sanctuary, this story will resonate with you. Stay with me, because the vengeance in this story is built entirely on paper and cold math. I should tell you what I do for a living, because it dictates exactly how I responded to that piece of paper. I am a corporate compliance auditor. My specialty is tracking falsified freight logs and finding the quiet lies hidden inside intricate supply chains. My days are spent tracing ghosts. When a shipping company claims a container holds textiles, but the weight points to electronics, I find the discrepancy. When a vendor bills for 1,000 units, but the warehouse only scans 800, I track the missing 200. I live in the margins. I know that people rarely commit a crime in a single bold move. They do it in increments. They test the system. They slide a slip of paper across a table to see if anyone pushes back. Valerie's rent invoice was a test of the system. She needed to know if I was paying attention. People lie in patterns. A forged invoice here, a missing shipping manifest there. After a decade in the field, I can read the shape of a fraud long before I have the proof in my hands. I trust spreadsheets, bank routing numbers, and the cold reality of a balance sheet. I do not jump to conclusions. I gather data. I trace the money. To understand my possessiveness over this house, you must understand the math of my 20s. I did not inherit a trust fund. I did not have parents who could co-sign a loan. I spent 6 years eating instant ramen, working 80-hour weeks, and taking every overtime shift available. I missed vacations and birthday parties to save the $90,000 down payment. This house is my blood. My home in coastal Georgia is a sprawling property. It sits on a 1/4-acre lot with mature oak trees and a wraparound porch. The deed carries one name, mine. Leo moved in after we married. He worked in regional sales, bringing in a respectable salary, but he always claimed his income was tied up in long-term investments and old student debts. I never pressed him to show me the statements. I paid the mortgage, the property taxes, and the insurance without asking for a dime. I believed marriage was a partnership where the math would eventually balance out over a lifetime. That was my only mistake. I left my own marriage off the ledger. 2 months ago, the dynamic shifted. Leo came to me with a rehearsed pitch. His mother, Valerie, and his sister, Natalie, needed a place to stay. Natalie was pivoting her event planning business, and Valerie was supposedly helping her fund the transition. They needed a temporary runway to get back on their feet. The guest wing is attached to the main house, but functions as its own suite, complete with a kitchenette, a full bathroom, and a separate entrance. It was designed to offer privacy. I agreed to let them move in because my marriage felt stable, and I was raised to open doors for family when they knock. When Valerie and Natalie moved in, they treated that privacy as sovereignty. They began receiving packages daily. They adjusted the thermostat to their liking without asking. They parked their vehicles in the center of the driveway, forcing me to park on the street. I let it all happen because I believed peace was worth the inconvenience. I did not realize I was funding an occupation. The first fracture in that stability appeared on a Tuesday morning, a week before the rent invoice. I walked into my kitchen at 6 in the morning to brew my daily coffee. The glass jar holding my imported espresso beans sat empty by the sink. In its place, Valerie had left a bulk tin of cheap, bitter grounds. It was a minor change, but it was not an accident. It was a subtle territorial claim, a guest testing the waters of ownership by replacing the host's preferences with her own. I noted the anomaly. I brewed the bitter coffee, drank it black, and went to work. I did not complain. A good auditor logs the first red flag in silence and waits for the second. The second red flag was the $1,000 invoice sitting on my counter. Let us return to that moment. Leo telling me to contribute. Valerie watching me with polite expectation. Natalie smirking over her salad. If you show a thief you are angry, they learn what you know and they start hiding their tracks. The urge to confront is the urge that loses. So I did not raise my voice. Shouting is a currency I refuse to spend. I picked up the invoice, I folded it neatly into perfect thirds, slipped it into my pocket, and gave Valerie a calm, pleasant smile. I told her I would look over the household budget and see what I could do. The satisfaction in the room was instant. Leo exhaled, his shoulders dropping into a relaxed posture. Valerie nodded, praising my maturity and my willingness to support the family. Natalie went back to scrolling on her phone. They thought they had won. They thought they had successfully established dominance in a house they did not own. But as I cleared the dinner plates and loaded the dishwasher, my mind was already shifting gears. The wife had left the room. The auditor had taken the wheel. Leo's justification echoed in my head. My money is mine, and yours is yours. It was a strange defense. A man who lives rent-free in his wife's home does not usually demand she pay rent to his mother unless there is a structural deficit somewhere else. They were not asking for $1,000 because they needed grocery money. Valerie wore designer slacks. Natalie drove a luxury SUV. Leo bought premium golf clubs just last month. There was cash flowing through this family, but none of it was going toward the roof over their heads. I want to pause here and emphasize something important. The hardest part of discovering a betrayal is not the anger, it is the clarity. When you finally stop making excuses for the people you love, the truth is often sitting right on the surface, waiting to be read. I had ignored the small discrepancies for years. Leo's evasiveness about his tax returns, his insistence on managing the mail, the way he always rushed to pay the restaurant bill with a specific credit card I was never allowed to see. I had logged all these anomalies in the back of my mind and labeled them as quirks. Sitting in my kitchen, I reclassified them as evidence. That night, after the house went dark and Leo fell asleep beside me, I did not cry. I slipped out of bed, walked down the hall to my home office, and locked the door behind me. I opened my laptop. The screen glowed in the dark room, casting a pale light over my desk. If Leo insisted on maintaining separate finances, it was time I learned exactly where his paycheck was going. I opened a new spreadsheet. I titled it with Leo's name. and I began the forensic audit of my own marriage. I pulled up our joint household checking account. On paper, it was meant for shared expenses like utilities and groceries. His paycheck deposited there, and he would move a portion to his private accounts. But I had spent a decade finding the one number that does not belong. And there it was, sitting in plain sight, once I stopped trusting the man who put it there. The numbers lined themselves up into a shape I could not unsee. A shape that promised a long, calculated war. The house settled into the deep, echoing quiet that only comes after midnight. From down the hall, I could hear the faint, rhythmic hum of the central air conditioning and the distant ticking of the grandfather clock in the foyer. In the master bedroom, Leo was sleeping. His breathing was slow and even, the untroubled rest of a man who believed his secrets were securely locked away. I sat in my home office with the door shut, the only light in the room radiating from my laptop screen. The cool blue glow washed over the walls, illuminating my grandmother's antique armchair in the corner and the neat stacks of corporate files on my desk. I pulled my cardigan tighter around my shoulders. The temperature in the house was fine, but a distinct chill had settled in my veins. If my husband insisted on running our household like a divided corporation, it was time for me to audit the books. I opened a blank spreadsheet. The grid stared back at me, a clean slate waiting for the truth. For 2 years, I had respected the boundary Leo drew around his income. He paid for his own vehicle, managed his own student loans, and covered his personal expenses. We maintained a joint checking account for shared utilities, to which he contributed a flat rate every month. Beyond that, I never asked to see his pay stubs. I was raised to believe trust was the foundation of a marriage. Tonight, I realized trust is just a ledger with missing entries. Before I even logged into the bank portal, my mind began organizing the discrepancies I had witnessed over the past few weeks. An auditor does not start by looking at numbers. We start by looking at behavior. We look for the friction between what a person claims and how they live. The first discrepancy belonged to Natalie. When she moved into my guest wing, the narrative Leo sold me was a story of a struggling entrepreneur. Natalie ran an event planning business that supposedly took a heavy hit during the off-season. She needed a temporary sanctuary to rebrand and rebuild her client list. Yet, 3 days after she unpacked her boxes, a delivery driver dropped off a pristine, brand-new luxury sport utility vehicle in my driveway. It was the top-tier trim featuring panoramic glass, custom alloy wheels, and an interior that smelled of rich, unblemished leather. Natalie parked it dead center in the driveway, forcing me to maneuver my sedan onto the street. When I asked her about the vehicle, she casually flipped the heavy silver key fob around her finger and claimed it was a business lease, a necessary expense to project success to high-end clients. But a woman whose business is failing does not sign a lease on a vehicle that retails for more than a down payment on a house. People with actual wealth drive their cars for years. People pretending to have wealth buy depreciating assets to convince strangers they matter. The vehicle was a glaring error in the narrative. It made no sense. I logged into the portal for our joint checking account. The screen populated with a long list of mundane transactions, grocery store trips, water bills, random charges from the local pharmacy. To an untrained eye, it looked like the boring, predictable financial footprint of a married couple. I clicked the Export button and downloaded the past 24 months of transaction history into my spreadsheet. I applied a filter. I removed the utility companies, the grocery chains, the insurance premiums. I scrubbed the white noise from the data. What remained was a column of irregular spending. I sorted the column by dollar amount, descending from highest to lowest. The spreadsheet refreshed. The data snapped into perfect, right-justified rows. My breath caught in my throat. The quiet of the office seemed to press inward, thickening the air. Staring back at me from the top of the column was a pattern so clean it felt like a physical strike. $3,000. Every single month on the 15th day, exactly $3,000 vanished from our joint account. The transfers started the exact same month we returned from our honeymoon. The outward flow was labeled with a generic bank processing code, routing the funds to an external entity named Crescent Holdings LLC. I sat very still. I did not cry. I did not rush down the hall to shake Leo awake. I placed my hands flat on the cool wood of my desk and let the numbers speak to me. A recurring, identical withdrawal, leaving a joint account on the same day every month, is not an accident. It is an automated payment. Someone had set up an electronic siphon to drain my husband's income before he even had a chance to spend it. $3,000 a month equals $36,000 a year. Over 2 years, $72,000 had been quietly funneled out of our shared ecosystem and into a black hole. My human instinct kicked in before my professional training could suppress it. My mind leaped to the most common painful conclusion: a mistress, a second life. Crescent Holdings LLC sounded like the kind of sterile, anonymous shell company a man might use to hide an apartment lease across town for another woman. I felt the familiar sharp sting of potential betrayal. I braced myself for the cliché heartbreak, imagining Leo buying jewelry and booking hotel rooms while I worked late hours to pay the mortgage on the house he slept in. I pictured another woman driving a luxury car funded by my husband. The humiliation tasted like copper on my tongue. But I am not just a wife. I am a forensic investigator. I forced the emotion down and focused on the data. I opened a new browser tab and accessed the state registry for corporate filings. I typed in the name of the entity. The search engine spun for a fraction of a second before delivering the public record. Crescent Holdings LLC was registered locally right here in coastal Georgia. I pulled the incorporation documents and reviewed the registered agent. The name on the filing was a local corporate attorney, a standard practice for shielding the true owner's identity. But the human element always leaves a footprint. I cross-referenced the bank processing codes tied to the outgoing transfers. The numeric strings associated with the ACH routing did not point to a residential property management firm. They did not point to luxury retail florists or high-end travel agencies. The clearinghouse codes matched institutional debt servicing. The red herring of an affair evaporated, replaced by a reality that was far colder. Leo was not funding a romance. He was paying off a high-yield structured liability. The puzzle pieces began to snap together, forming a chilling picture. Leo's defensive posture at dinner, his insistence that his money was his own, the rent invoice Valerie pushed across the quartz island. None of this was random. Valerie was not demanding $1,000 a month because the household budget was tight. She wore tailored slacks, and Natalie drove a vehicle that cost more than most people earn in a year. They did not need grocery money. The rent invoice was a calculated boundary test. Valerie needed to know if I was docile enough to start handing over my own cash to subsidize their lifestyle. She was conditioning me. If I accepted the demotion from homeowner to tenant, I would eventually accept paying their debts. The $3,000 hemorrhage was the true threat. Leo's separate finances speech was just the armor guarding a massive secret obligation. He was bleeding cash to an unknown entity, and his family had moved into my home to escape the financial fallout of whatever that debt represented. The math had a distinct smell to it, a pungent, metallic scent of desperation wrapped in arrogance. They thought I was a naive woman who would sign checks to keep the peace. They thought I would pay rent for a kitchen I designed in a house I bought while my husband funded a shadow corporation. I closed the public registry tab and stared at the glowing spreadsheet. The numbers were perfect, undeniable, and ruthless. I promised myself right then that I would match their ruthlessness. I was going to trace every single cent hiding behind Crescent Holdings. I was going to find out exactly what Leo purchased with that automated payment. To do that, I needed to bypass the digital firewall and find the physical paper trail. People who hide money always keep receipts. They just put them where they think no one will ever look. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the closed office door. I recalled the heavy, cloying scent of floral perfume that had been lingering near the front entryway for the past 2 weeks. I realized I had not seen a physical piece of mail addressed to me since Valerie unpacked her bags. The next step of the audit was clear, and it required stepping out of the digital realm and into the guest wing. To understand my possessiveness over this piece of real estate, you must understand the mathematics of my 20s. I did not stumble into homeownership through a fortunate inheritance or a generous wedding gift. My foundation was built on exhaustion. For 6 consecutive years, I survived on a diet of high-sodium instant noodles and tepid break-room coffee. I worked grueling 80-hour weeks, taking every available holiday shift and overnight assignment. My career involved auditing international supply chains, which meant I spent my youth staring at customs declarations and shipping manifests until the text blurred into gray lines. I traced missing inventory across oceans, finding lost capital for multinational corporations. Every bonus I earned, every hour of overtime I logged, went directly into a high-yield savings account. $90,000. That was the exact figure required to avoid private mortgage insurance and secure the lowest possible interest rate. It took thousands of days of relentless, grinding discipline to accumulate that down payment. When I finally sat at the mahogany table in the closing attorney's office and signed my name to the deed, I was not just buying a structure comprised of wood, brick, and drywall. I was purchasing my independence. This house is my blood. It is the physical manifestation of my survival and my discipline. The hardwood floors, the vaulted ceilings, the quiet corners where I read on Sunday mornings, they all belong to the girl who worked herself to the bone to earn them. Nobody gets to take this sanctuary away from me. Knowing the origin of my territory brings us to the third layer of the ongoing conflict, the administration of my property. The morning after I discovered the recurring digital hemorrhage in Leo's bank records, I walked downstairs to the foyer. I needed to check the mail catch tray situated beneath the polished brass slot in the front door. The tray was empty. It had been entirely bare for days. However, the air surrounding the entryway console was far from empty. It was thick with a cloying, heavy scent, gardenia mixed with synthetic rose, Valerie's signature floral perfume. The fragrance hung in the air like an invisible tripwire. It was a sensory clue that my mother-in-law was spending a significant amount of time hovering around the front entrance. I stood in the foyer and mentally inventoried the recent postal deliveries, or rather, the distinct lack thereof. I had not seen a single property tax assessment, a water bill, a homeowner association newsletter, or a financial statement all month. Usually that console is littered with a mix of junk correspondence and official notices. Now the surface was pristine. A clean desk is often the very first indicator of a cover-up. Valerie was acting as an unauthorized gatekeeper, deliberately filtering the information entering my residence. I needed to prove she was intercepting my correspondence without tipping my hand. I drove to my corporate office and spent my lunch hour crafting a piece of bait. I took a standard windowed envelope and printed a formal-looking document to place inside. I utilized a return address that mimicked a major regional financial institution, complete with a generated barcode and official typography. I addressed it directly to myself, marked the exterior as urgent and confidential, and dropped it into a blue collection box on the street outside my building. 2 days later, I adjusted my schedule to work from home. I positioned myself in my office, sitting slightly behind the sheer linen curtains, maintaining a clear line of sight to the front porch. At exactly 1 in the afternoon, the postal carrier's familiar white truck pulled up to the curb. Before the carrier could even walk up the front steps, the heavy oak door swung open. Valerie stood on the threshold, wearing her silk bathrobe, offering the carrier a charming, practiced smile. She engaged him in a brief, pleasant conversation, reached out to take the thick stack of envelopes directly from his hands, and closed the door. I stepped out of my office and moved silently down the carpeted hallway, stopping just before the main landing. I controlled my breathing and listened. I heard the distinct rustle of paper being shuffled. I heard Valerie's heavy, purposeful footsteps making their way toward the guest wing. I crept to the edge of the corridor and watched her reflection in the tall mirror mounted on the wall. Valerie sorted through the stack with quick, practiced motions. She isolated the official-looking envelope I had fabricated, examined the urgent warning printed on the front, and slipped it directly into the deep pocket of her robe. She discarded the remaining grocery store flyers and restaurant coupons onto the console tray, then disappeared into her bedroom, shutting the door firmly behind her. The trap had worked flawlessly. The interception was confirmed. Later that afternoon, Valerie emerged from the guest suite dressed in her tailored slacks, announcing she was heading out for a manicure. Leo was across town at his sales job. Natalie was ostensibly meeting a prospective client. The house was finally empty. I did not waste a single second. I walked straight into the guest wing. The space smelled overwhelmingly of that same gardenia perfume, masking the scent of the citrus cleaner I usually used. I ignored the clutter of makeup on the dresser and the unmade bed, focusing my attention on the far corner of the room. Sitting on the floor, partially obscured by a decorative armchair, was a vintage wooden chest. It featured heavy, dark iron hinges and a prominent, old-fashioned brass keyhole. She was utilizing a 19th century security measure to hide contemporary secrets from a 21st century fraud investigator. The sheer irony of her strategy was almost humorous. I turned around and walked out to the garage, locating my secure metal toolbox. I retrieved a slim black leather case. Inside lay a set of standard tension wrenches and varied PIX tools I acquired during a specialized corporate security audit training seminar many years ago. You would be surprised how often locked filing cabinets in executive offices hold the answers to missing inventory, making physical bypass techniques a useful skill in my profession. I returned to the guest wing and knelt in front of the wooden chest. The brass plate surrounding the keyhole was cold under my fingertips. I selected a flat tension wrench and inserted it into the bottom edge of the lock, applying a very light, consistent rotational pressure with my index finger. I slid a standard hook pick into the top portion of the keyhole, feeling for the internal brass pins. One by one, I manipulated the tumblers, pushing them upward until they caught on the shear line. The mechanism was archaic, clumsy, and poorly maintained. It offered almost no resistance against a trained hand. Exactly 12 seconds later, the internal cylinder turned with a soft, satisfying metallic click. I withdrew my tools and placed them in my pocket. I placed both hands on the heavy wooden lid and lifted it upward. The iron hinges let out a faint, whining creak. I looked inside the dark interior and felt the oxygen leave the room. The chest was not a storage bin for extra sweaters, old photographs, or nostalgic keepsakes. It was a functioning, highly organized shadow accounting system operating right under my roof. Manila folders were stacked in neat vertical rows, labeled with dates and generic expense categories written in Valerie's looping handwriting. Right in the center of the arrangement sat a thick stack of my missing mail, bound together with a thick rubber band. I saw my quarterly property tax statements. I saw my homeowner association fee notices. I saw the dummy envelope I had mailed to myself just 48 hours ago. And beneath all of those, sitting near the bottom of the stack, was a crisp, unopened envelope bearing the embossed logo of a secondary lending institution. It was a bank I had never done business with, a lender I had never authorized to review my credit. I reached down into the chest and picked up the mysterious envelope, feeling the heavy weight of the premium paper between my fingers. This was not a misplaced utility bill. This was not a simple boundary violation by an overbearing mother-in-law. This was the architectural blueprint of a hostile financial takeover, and my name was printed right on the front. I did not pull the original documents out of the wooden chest. Physical removal is a novice mistake. When you investigate corporate fraud, you never disturb the primary evidence until you possess the legal authority to seize it. Taking the paper would alert Valerie the moment she opened her archaic lockbox. Instead, I reached into my pocket and retrieved my phone. I silenced the device, deactivated the camera flash, and crouched lower to the carpet to utilize the natural sunlight filtering through the guest room blinds. I hovered the lens over the manila folders. I documented everything. Every receipt, every scribbled note, every bank routing code written in Valerie's distinct looping cursive. The crisp envelope with the embossed secondary lender logo commanded my attention. I used the tip of my pen to gently lift the unsealed flap, sliding the multi-page statement out just enough to capture the text without wrinkling the paper. The institution was a prominent regional credit union, one that specializes in high-yield lending and rapid approvals. I focused the camera on the account summary box located in the upper right-hand corner. The product classification read, Home Equity Line of Credit. The total credit limit was listed at $150,000. The available credit remaining on the account was exactly zero. The line was exhausted. Every single dollar had been drawn down in a series of swift, calculated transfers. I scrolled my eyes down to the borrower information block. There, printed in stark black typography, was Leo's full name. Sitting directly beneath his name, sharing the legal liability, was my own. Idana Cooper. A cold clarity washed over my vision, sharpening the edges of the room. In the state of Georgia, you cannot leverage residential equity without the explicit, authorized signature of the primary deed holder. I had never signed a loan application. I had never spoken to a loan officer. I had never authorized a credit pull. My signature had been manufactured. Forging a signature on a standard contract is a simple act of deception, but a home equity line of credit requires a sworn authentication. It requires a notary public to verify the identity of the signers under penalty of perjury. As I knelt on the floor, a specific memory surfaced from the archives of my mind. It was a warm evening last summer. We were hosting a barbecue on the back patio. Leo had consumed a few beers and was laughing with our neighbors, recounting stories of his childhood. He mentioned Valerie's career history. Before she styled herself as an affluent matriarch, she worked as a paralegal and legal secretary for a downtown litigation firm throughout the late 90s. Leo had chuckled, pointing a pair of grilling tongs in the air, bragging that his mother still knew her way around a notary stamp and possessed contacts in every county clerk office. At the time, it sounded like a harmless exaggeration, a son inflating his mother's resume. Today, it was the missing link in a felony. Valerie had weaponized her old administrative network. She secured a corrupt electronic notary, an old colleague willing to apply their digital seal to a fraudulent application without verifying my physical presence. They bypassed the legal safeguards of home ownership with a phone call and a favor. They digitized my identity and used it to unlock the vault. I shifted my focus back to the financial statement displayed on my phone screen. I navigated to the payment schedule section. The current interest rate was steep, a variable figure tied to the prime lending market. I calculated the amortization schedule in my head, a skill honed by years of analyzing corporate debt structures. A maximum balance of $150,000 at that specific interest rate yields a minimum monthly payment of exactly $3,000. The puzzle assembled itself in my mind with terrifying precision. The recurring anomaly I discovered in our joint checking account last night was not a savings deposit. The $3,000 Leo transferred out on the 15th of every month was the required minimum payment to keep this fraudulent loan out of default. He was not protecting his personal wealth from a demanding wife. He was servicing a secret debt. My husband had leveraged the equity of my premarital property, the asset I starved myself in my 20s to purchase, to extract a six-figure payout. He mortgaged my sanctuary to fund his family. The money went to Crescent Holdings, LLC, the shell company Valerie operated, paying for Natalie's luxury vehicle and whatever other indulgences they desired. When Leo told me to contribute to the household budget at the dinner table, he was not being stingy. He was projecting. He was projecting his own financial ruin onto me, hoping I would open my wallet and relieve the pressure of the crime he committed against me. Betrayal of this magnitude usually elicits a visceral, physiological response, a spiking heart rate, trembling hands, a sudden inability to draw breath. I experienced none of those things. I felt the cold, professional stillness that precedes a finalized audit. When you stare at the undeniable proof of a crime, emotion becomes a liability. Anger is a distraction. Grief is a luxury you cannot afford until the perpetrators are removed from the premises. The woman who loved Leo ceased to exist in that guest bedroom. She was replaced entirely by the compliance auditor. If I walked out of the guest wing and confronted Leo with the photographs right now, he would panic. He would call his mother. They would realize the security of their lockbox was compromised. Confronting them now would only give them time to destroy the paper trail, coordinate their lies, and perhaps even file preemptive legal maneuvers to tie up the property in a messy divorce proceeding. I needed them to remain comfortable. I needed them to believe I was still the blind, compliant wife who folded the rent invoice and smiled. I used my pen to push the credit union statement back into its envelope, ensuring the paper aligned perfectly with the edges. I placed the envelope near the bottom of the stack, exactly where Valerie had hidden it. I closed the heavy wooden lid of the vintage chest, allowing the iron hinges to settle back into their original position. I retrieved my tension wrench and hook pick, sliding them back into the brass keyhole. With a swift, practiced motion, I reset the tumblers securing the lock. I wiped the brass plate with the sleeve of my cardigan to remove any trace of my fingerprints. The guest room looked undisturbed. The cloying scent of gardenia perfume hung in the air, masking the profound shift in the balance of power. I walked out of the guest wing and returned to my home office. I sat at my desk and looked at the data on my computer monitor. I possessed the forged financial statement. I understood the mechanics of the $3,000 monthly drain. I knew Valerie provided the corrupt notary. The execution of the theft was documented, but a new question demanded an answer. $150,000 is a vast sum of capital. A luxury lease and tailored clothing account for a mere fraction of that total. People who steal that aggressively are usually covering a deficit, not building a surplus. If Crescent Holdings LLC was the destination for the stolen equity, I needed to trace the routing numbers embedded in the LLC records. I needed to know exactly what they purchased with my blood money. I returned to the cool blue glow of my computer monitor, leaving the physical evidence safely locked inside the guest bedroom. The high-resolution photographs I captured were already syncing to an encrypted external drive on my desk. Having the forged credit union statement was a crucial victory, but in the realm of financial forensics, a loan document only tells you how the vault was opened. It does not tell you where the gold was buried. I needed to map the exact destination of the stolen equity. Before I executed any form of retaliation, I had to understand the anatomy of my enemy. I opened the image files containing Valerie's handwritten ledgers and the loose receipts she carelessly tossed into the wooden chest. Crescent Holdings LLC was the central artery pumping stolen capital into their lives, and I was going to dissect every single transaction. In my daily profession, tracking corporate funds requires navigating complex vendor networks and international tax havens. Tracing a domestic shell company run by an amateur was an exercise in basic arithmetic. I zoomed in on a photograph of a bank reconciliation statement tied to the LLC. The document provided the full routing and account numbers for the holding company. I entered these figures into a specialized database query I occasionally use for vendor verification. The search yielded a trail of clearinghouse codes linking the LLC to a web of external merchant processors. I decided to start small. Criminals often hide their most profound disrespect in mundane details. I reviewed a photograph of a crumpled receipt from a regional wholesale club dated precisely 1 week prior. The purchase was made using a debit card linked directly to Crescent Holdings. I read the itemized list. It included bulk paper towels, laundry detergent, and a large tin of dark roast commercial blend coffee. I stared at the screen, letting the data synchronize with my memory. The cost of the coffee grounds was $14.99. This was the exact brand of bitter, low-quality coffee Valerie had left by my sink the morning my imported espresso beans mysteriously vanished. She had not simply thrown away my preferred blend to assert dominance. She had utilized a debit card funded by my stolen home equity to purchase the substandard replacement. My own money financed the petty insult. The psychology behind that $14 purchase was staggering. Valerie sat in my kitchen drinking a beverage subsidized by a felony committed against my name and expected me to feel grateful for her contribution to the pantry. It was a microscopic indignity, but it illuminated the sheer depth of their entitlement. They viewed my resources as their personal reservoir, available for both grand theft and minor slights. I set the coffee receipt aside and turned my attention to the larger ledger. $150,000 had been drawn from the fraudulent credit line. If Natalie's event planning enterprise was a legitimate operation, the expense reports should reflect standard industry overhead. I looked for catering deposits, floral wholesale invoices, commercial venue reservations, and liability insurance premiums. The ledger contained none of those things. Instead, the outgoing cash flow from Crescent Holdings painted a picture of a business that produced nothing and provided no services. There was a substantial monthly auto draft to a luxury car dealership, which accounted for the pristine sport utility vehicle parked in my driveway. There were erratic payments to high-end retail boutiques and fine dining establishments. Natalie was not an entrepreneur struggling through a seasonal downturn. She was a dependent utilizing a fake business title to justify drawing a salary from a criminal slush fund. The event planning company was a glossy, hollow facade designed to explain their sudden influx of cash to any curious neighbors or relatives. But retail therapy and a luxury vehicle lease only accounted for a fraction of the missing 6 figures. I scrolled further down the digital record, chasing the bulk of the missing capital. I isolated a series of rapid, substantial outbound wire transfers initiated over the past 60 days. The amounts varied wildly: $12,000 on a Tuesday, $18,000 on a Friday, $5,000 on a Sunday morning. The recipients were obscured by generic processing names, but the merchant category codes attached to the wires told a definitive story. In the compliance industry, every digital transaction is tagged with a 4-digit classification number. It is how banks identify the nature of a business for risk assessment. The transfers leaving Valerie's shell company were universally tagged with the code 7995. I did not need to consult a manual to know what that number represented. It is the universal identifier for betting, including lottery tickets, casino gaming chips, off-track betting, and wagers at racetracks. I traced the processing names through a secondary financial registry. The wires were split between 2 distinct destinations. Half the funds were funneled to offshore digital gaming sites entities registered in jurisdictions known for loose regulatory oversight and anonymous accounts. The other half was directed to a prominent casino resort located 3 hours north of our city. Valerie was not just playing penny slots on the weekend. She was initiating structured wire transfers to cover massive accumulating markers. The final layer of the mystery dissolved, revealing a truth far more pathetic than a calculated business scheme. Valerie possessed a catastrophic, undisclosed gambling addiction. The elegant slacks, the signature floral perfume, the demanding posture at the dinner table, it was all an elaborate theater performed by a woman drowning in debt. She was hemorrhaging cash, chasing losses across digital card tables and casino floors. This revelation recontextualized my entire marriage. I thought back to the early years, remembering Leo's constant excuses about his personal finances. He always claimed his sales commissions were tied up in aggressive long-term stock portfolios or dedicated to paying down substantial high-interest student loans. I had trusted his ambition. Now, viewing the casino wire transfers, I realized there were no investment portfolios. There were no student loans. Leo had spent our entire marriage functioning as his mother's financial enabler. He had been bailing her out of gambling debts for years, secretly channeling his income to cover her losses. That was why he demanded strict separation of our accounts. He needed a veil of privacy to hide the fact that he was subsidizing an addict. When the offshore gaming sites and local casinos finally cut off her credit and the threat of total bankruptcy loomed, Leo's paycheck was no longer sufficient to plug the holes in a sinking ship. Desperation breeds audacity. He needed a massive, immediate injection of capital to save his mother from public ruin and legal collections. He looked around for an available asset, and his eyes landed on the pristine, untouched equity sitting inside the house I owned. My husband did not forge a loan document to fund a brilliant investment strategy. He committed felony bank fraud to cover the staggering gambling debts of a woman who repaid my hospitality by charging me rent. He imported his mother and sister into my guest wing because they had likely lost their own housing or were on the verge of eviction, and he needed them close to control the fallout. I sat back in my chair, exhaling a long, slow breath into the silent office. The sheer stupidity of their plan was almost insulting. They had stolen $150,000, and instead of using it to generate revenue or secure stable housing, they were actively gambling it away. The fraudulent home equity line of credit was maxed out. There was no more available capital to draw from. The only thing remaining was the required $3,000 monthly minimum payment to keep the lender from initiating foreclosure proceedings. Leo was transferring his entire disposable income into Crescent Holdings every month just to keep the bank at bay, while Valerie continued to drain whatever residual cash remained. They were sitting in my living room, feigning superiority, wearing designer clothes and demanding $1,000 contribution from me, while secretly treading water in a rapidly rising flood of liabilities. The math was not just a discrepancy anymore. It was a ticking time bomb. If Leo missed a single $3,000 payment, the credit union would issue a notice of default. The facade would crack. The bank would investigate the asset. The forged notary seal would inevitably be subjected to scrutiny. They were balancing a six-figure felony on the edge of a knife, hoping I would remain compliant, hoping I would continue paying the primary mortgage so they could afford to service their crime. I closed the image files and powered down my laptop. The blue light faded, returning the office to darkness. I understood the architecture of their fraud perfectly. I knew the origin of the theft, the destination of the funds, and the vulnerable pressure point holding their entire universe together. I did not need to engage in a screaming match in the kitchen. I did not need to throw Valerie's cheap coffee grounds onto the front lawn. To destroy a parasite, you do not attack the host. You simply sever the blood supply. The automated withdrawal from our joint account was scheduled to process in exactly 14 days. It was time to introduce my husband to the unyielding consequences of a frozen asset, and I knew exactly which corporate attorney I needed to call in the morning to make it happen. The following morning, I took a personal day from my auditing firm and drove downtown. I bypassed the standard family law practices located near the courthouse and headed straight for the financial district. My destination was the polished corner office of Naomi Vance. Naomi is a real estate litigator renowned throughout the coastal business community for her surgical precision in dismantling fraudulent contracts. She is a woman who communicates in clauses and statutes, possessing zero tolerance for sentimentality. That is exactly the type of intellect I required. I sat in a leather chair across from her expansive desk and laid out my printed photographs. I presented the forged credit union statement, the shadow accounting ledgers, the offshore wire transfers, and the notary commission number attached to the fraudulent signature. Naomi adjusted her reading glasses, reviewing the documentation in silence for several minutes. She examined the notary stamp with the scrutiny of a jeweler appraising a questionable diamond. When she finally looked up, she folded her hands over the evidence. She asked if I wanted her to draft a divorce petition immediately to freeze the marital assets. I shook my head. I told her I did not need a divorce yet. I needed a guillotine. Divorce proceedings can be drawn out for years. Judges often mandate mediation, ordering both parties to maintain the financial status quo while the lawyers argue over discovery. I refused to spend the next 2 years subsidizing my husband's criminal enterprise under a court order. I needed to isolate my property from his inevitable collapse before the wreckage could drag me under. Naomi leaned back and outlined a ruthless, elegant strategy. Before we brought the forgery to light, we needed to alter the ownership structure of the real estate. Under her guidance, I signed the paperwork to transfer the deed of my 5-bedroom home into a newly formed irrevocable blind trust. As the sole original owner who purchased the property with premarital funds, I possessed the legal right to reassign the asset. By placing the house inside a trust, I effectively removed my individual name from the public tax registry. The property was now insulated. If Leo's creditors came looking for assets to seize when his house of cards collapsed, they would encounter a labyrinth of corporate privacy laws blocking their path. With my primary asset shielded, I returned to my neighborhood. I pulled my sedan into the driveway, noting Natalie's leased luxury sport utility vehicle occupying the prime parking space near the front door. I walked inside, ready to execute the second phase of the operation. I entered the living room and stopped in my tracks. Valerie was standing by the fireplace, humming a cheerful tune. She was holding a stack of old newspapers and a large cardboard box. Scattered across the coffee table were my decorative vases. They were hand-blown cobalt blue glass pieces I had purchased during a solo trip to the Mediterranean years ago. They were expensive, fragile, and deeply personal. Valerie was casually wrapping them in the newspaper, burying them at the bottom of the cardboard box. Natalie sat lounging on the sofa nearby, scrolling through social media on her phone, entirely unbothered by her mother packing up the host's belongings. I asked Valerie what she was doing. She offered a dismissive, patronizing wave of her hand. She claimed the living room felt cluttered. She said the blue glass clashed with the warm family aesthetic she was trying to cultivate in the shared spaces. She was replacing my art with cheap, generic picture frames she bought at a discount store. It was a classic territorial display. She was erasing my footprint from the physical environment, reshaping the room to reflect her dominance. A week ago, this blatant disrespect would have sparked a tense argument. I would have demanded she unpack my belongings and respect my boundaries. But the woman standing in the living room today was not a frustrated wife. I was a financial executioner, holding a signed trust agreement in my briefcase. I looked at the cardboard box. I looked at Valerie's smug expression. I felt the corners of my mouth lift into a serene, compliant smile. I told her the generic frames looked lovely. I told her to store the vases wherever she thought was best. Valerie blinked, momentarily disarmed by my total lack of resistance. She exchanged a triumphant glance with Natalie. They believed they had broken my spirit. They thought the rent invoice had successfully conditioned me to accept my new subservient role. I walked past them, heading straight for my home office, leaving them to decorate a house they would soon be expelled from. I locked my office door and sat down at my computer. It was time to sever the blood supply. My first phone call was to the Human Resources Department at my auditing firm. I provided them with a new routing number for a secure, independent account I had opened at a separate financial institution that morning. I rerouted my entire direct deposit. My paycheck would no longer mingle with Leo's funds. I also established new automated payment schedules for my primary mortgage, the property taxes, and the homeowner insurance. I ensured those critical obligations were paid directly from my new account. My credit score remained a pristine, unassailable fortress. The second phone call required a brief performance. I dialed the customer service hotline for the bank that hosted our joint checking account. I navigated the automated menus until I reached a human representative. I requested an immediate transfer to the fraud prevention department. A specialist named David answered the line. I kept my voice steady, injecting just the right amount of concerned confusion into my tone. I explained that I was reviewing my recent statements and noticed unauthorized recurring electronic withdrawals. I provided the dates and the amounts, specifically targeting the $3,000 transfers directed to Crescent Holdings. I told David I had no knowledge of this entity and had never authorized these payments. Banking institutions operate under strict federal regulations regarding unverified withdrawals. The moment a primary account holder reports suspicious activity tied to an unknown limited liability company, automated security protocols are triggered. David informed me that to protect my assets, the bank was required to lock the joint checking account immediately. I gave him my verbal consent. With a few keystrokes on David's end, the trap snapped shut. All debit cards linked to the account were suspended. All automated clearinghouse transfers were permanently blocked, pending a formal investigation. The digital vault was sealed. I thanked David for his diligence and hung up the phone. The architecture of the cutoff was complete. The beauty of this maneuver lay in its silence. I did not have to touch Leo's money to destroy him. I simply changed the locks on the digital door. When Leo's next paycheck was deposited by his employer, the funds would land in the frozen joint account. He would be unable to withdraw cash, swipe his debit card, or pay his personal bills. More importantly, when the fraudulent home equity line of credit attempted its scheduled $3,000 automated pull on the 15th of the month, the transaction would hit a brick wall. The credit union would receive a rejection code. They would generate a non-sufficient funds penalty. The internal algorithms designed to track delinquent loans would flag the account. The burden of the felony debt now rested squarely on Leo's empty pockets. For the next 2 weeks, I played the role of the perfect accommodating spouse. The psychological discipline required to maintain this charade was immense. Every evening, I stood in the kitchen and cooked dinner for the people who had conspired to ruin my life. I roasted chicken, chopped vegetables, and poured wine into crystal glasses. I sat at the quartz island and listened to Leo complain about the stress of his regional sales quotas. I listened to Natalie lament the rising costs of marketing her non-existent event planning business. I smiled through Valerie's condescending remarks about my cooking techniques and her constant reminders that family always supports one another. They ate my food and drank my wine, secure in their belief that they held all the leverage. They thought they had successfully manipulated the ledger, but I knew something they did not. The banking system is a relentless, emotionless machine. It does not care about family aesthetics or verbal excuses. It only cares about the balance sheet. I watched the calendar on my phone inch closer to the 15th of the month. I went to sleep every night with a profound sense of peace, letting the automated financial networks do what they do best, collect. The 15th day of the month arrived with a quiet, gray dawn. In the financial sector, the 15th is a cornerstone date. It is the day payroll clears, corporate invoices mature, and automated clearinghouses execute millions of scheduled electronic transfers. It was the day the secondary lending institution would reach into my husband's digital pocket and attempt to extract their required $3,000 payment. I woke up, brewed a cup of black tea, and waited for the ecosystem to break. The real-world consequences of a severed financial artery do not manifest as a sudden explosion. They appear in beautiful, agonizing increments. The initial symptom of the drought materialized shortly before noon. I was sitting at my home office desk, reviewing a client compliance file, when the smart bulb in my desk lamp flickered and disconnected from the network. A small yellow icon appeared on my computer screen, indicating the local wireless network had dropped. I opened my phone and checked the utility portal. The internet service provider had suspended the account due to a returned payment. The automated draft linked to the frozen joint checking account had bounced. The first domino had officially tipped over. I activated the cellular hotspot on my corporate mobile device, tethered my laptop, and seamlessly resumed my work. The disruption cost me less than 30 seconds. For Valerie, however, the loss of connectivity was a crisis. From my office doorway, I watched her pace the upstairs hallway. She stood in front of the console table, poking the reset button on the back of the wireless router. She unplugged the power cord, waited 10 seconds, and shoved it back into the outlet, muttering sharp curses under her breath. Her frustration was not about missing a television show. Without high-speed internet, she could not access her offshore digital gaming platforms. The casinos were closed to her. The synthetic dopamine drip she relied upon to manage her anxiety was abruptly shut off. She was experiencing the first tremors of withdrawal. I watched her tap her manicured fingernails against the plastic router casing, her polite matriarch facade slipping to reveal the irritable, panicked addict underneath. I offered no assistance. I simply closed my office door and let her suffer the silence. By 5 o'clock that evening, Leo returned home from his regional sales route. His posture was slightly rigid, his movements lacking their usual fluid arrogance. He walked into the kitchen, loosened his silk tie, and immediately poured himself a glass of bourbon. He had undoubtedly noticed small irregularities throughout the day. Perhaps a gas station terminal rejected his card, or a toll transponder failed to reload. He was a man accustomed to frictionless transactions. Experiencing friction meant something was wrong, but he had not yet grasped the sheer scale of the problem. He wanted to project control. He wanted to reassure himself that his carefully constructed universe was still intact. He clapped his hands together, forcing a bright, artificial smile. He announced that we were all going out for a family dinner. He wanted to treat us to the upscale steakhouse located in the historic downtown district. It was an establishment where the waiters wore white aprons, the menus lacked printed prices, and the valet parked your vehicle right by the front entrance. It was exactly the kind of venue Leo utilized to broadcast a specific socioeconomic status to his mother and sister. We took his sedan. The ride was filled with Natalie complaining about the lack of internet at the house, and Valerie offering unsolicited advice on how I should manage the utility companies better. I sat in the passenger seat, watching the city lights blur past the window, enjoying the profound irony of the situation. They were driving to a luxury restaurant fueled by entitlement, unaware that the man behind the steering wheel was financially deceased. The restaurant was crowded, filled with the low hum of expensive conversations and the clinking of crystal glasses. We were seated in a circular leather booth. Leo ordered a bottle of imported red wine for the table. Natalie ordered the most expensive cut of beef on the menu. Valerie spent the duration of the meal offering veiled critiques of my career, suggesting that a woman should focus less on corporate auditing and more on cultivating a welcoming home environment. I chewed my steak slowly, offering polite nods, absorbing every insult with the serene detachment of a predator watching its prey wander into a snare. The inevitable conclusion arrived alongside the dessert plates. The waiter approached the booth and placed a sleek black leather folio in the center of the table. Leo barely looked at it. He reached into his suit jacket, retrieved his heavy metallic credit card, and dropped it onto the bill with a practiced flick of his wrist. It was a gesture designed to look effortless. The waiter scooped up the folio and disappeared into the ambient shadows of the dining room. 4 minutes passed. The conversation at the table drifted toward Natalie's fictional upcoming business trip. Then the waiter returned. He did not place the folio back on the table. He leaned in close to Leo, keeping his voice discreet, adhering to the polite protocol of high-end hospitality. "I am sorry, sir," the waiter whispered, "but the terminal declined this card. Do you have an alternate method of payment? Leo's face flushed a deep, sudden crimson. The color crept up his neck and settled in his cheeks. He let out a loud, theatrical laugh designed to dismiss the embarrassment. "It must be a security flag," he told the waiter, waving a dismissive hand. "My bank is overly cautious with large dining charges. Just run my debit card." He pulled his primary bank card from his wallet. The plastic square linked directly to the joint checking account, the account I had frozen a week ago. The waiter took the card, his expression carefully neutral. He walked back to the point-of-sale terminal. I kept my eyes fixed on Leo. The bravado he projected a moment ago was dissolving. His hand drifted beneath the table. I heard the faint rustle of fabric as he retrieved his mobile phone from his pocket. He was going to check his banking application. The glow of the screen illuminated his face from below. I watched his eyes track the data. I saw the exact second the reality of his situation penetrated his denial. The theatrical annoyance evaporated, replaced by sheer, unadulterated terror. His pupils dilated, his breath hitched. The mobile application would not show a simple security hold. It would show a locked, inaccessible account. It would show the secondary lending institution's ruthless automated systems attempting to pull $3,000, hitting a wall, and generating cascading non-sufficient funds penalties. It would show that his safety net was gone, his credit line was exhausted, and his income was trapped behind an impenetrable digital barrier. The waiter returned for the second time. He placed the debit card on the table. "Declined again, sir," he stated, his voice losing a fraction of its former warmth. Leo sat frozen. He looked at his mother, then at his sister, and finally at me. He was a man drowning in a glass of water, unable to formulate a rescue plan. Before he could stammer a fragile excuse, Valerie seized the moment to assert her authority. She misread the entire dynamic. She assumed the declined cards were merely a clerical error, a temporary inconvenience beneath her notice. She believed she still held the high ground. She reached into her designer handbag. She did not pull out a wallet to cover the bill. Instead, she retrieved a folded piece of paper. She smoothed it out on the linen tablecloth and slid it directly across the table toward me, right past the rejected debit card. It was a second rent invoice. I looked at the document. It demanded the original $1,000 for the previous month, plus an additional $200 late fee for my failure to remit payment promptly. Valerie leaned forward, her expression tight and demanding. "Since Leo is dealing with a minor banking glitch," she said, her voice dripping with artificial sweetness, "this would be the perfect time for you to settle your household obligations, Adana. It is only fair you pull your weight." She was demanding I pay her for the privilege of living in my own house while her son sat paralyzed by the realization that their criminal slush fund was dry. The disconnect between her arrogance and her actual vulnerability was staggering. I did not reach for my purse. I did not offer to cover the expensive dinner they had just consumed. I picked up the invoice, holding it by the corners. "I am afraid I cannot process this request, Valerie," I said, keeping my tone bright and bureaucratic. "If you are operating a formal rental enterprise out of my guest wing, I am required to report the expense. I will need you to provide a completed tax document establishing your legal status as a landlord. Furthermore, I require an itemized receipt detailing exactly which portion of the property this fee covers, since the county deed currently lists me as the sole owner." Valerie glared at me. Her mouth opened, but no words came out. The legal jargon acted as a shield she could not pierce. She was a woman accustomed to emotional manipulation, and I was giving her compliance regulations. She did not realize the game had changed. She did not know the money keeping a roof over her head had just evaporated. I placed the invoice back on the table. I looked at Leo, whose face was pale and slick with a cold sweat. The silence stretched heavy and dangerous. The financial tourniquet had done its job. The blood flow was stopped. The only question remaining was what desperate, reckless maneuver my husband would attempt when we got back to the house. The 10th day following the restaurant incident ushered in a suffocating atmosphere inside my home. By day 25 of the financial blackout, the subtle decay of their fabricated wealth was impossible to ignore. A frozen bank account is a silent executioner. It does not shout, it simply starves the host. The ambient tension in the guest wing radiated through the drywall. Valerie no longer hummed her cheerful tunes while rearranging my furniture. Her heavy floral perfume began to smell stale, lacking the fresh application of someone who had places to go and money to spend. She spent her afternoons pacing the back patio, clutching her cell phone, undoubtedly fielding calls from collection agencies and offshore casino bookmakers, demanding their overdue balances. Leo mirrored her rapid decline. My husband transformed from a polished regional sales director into a hollow shell of a man. His suits hung loosely on his frame. He stopped dropping off his dress shirts at the dry cleaner, attempting to iron them himself in the kitchen with trembling hands. I watched him eat his breakfast cereal in silence, his eyes darting toward the front window every time a delivery truck rattled past our street. He was living in a constant state of hypervigilance. He knew the secondary lender was hunting for their missing $3,000. He knew the fraud algorithms were calculating his delinquency. The decay reached its physical peak late on a Tuesday night. I was asleep in the master bedroom, lying on the far edge of the mattress, miles away from Leo's tossing and turning. Around 2 a.m, a distinct mechanical noise pierced the quiet neighborhood. I opened my eyes. I did not move, but I listened intently. I heard the low, rumbling idle of a heavy-duty diesel engine pausing at the end of my driveway. I heard the heavy clank of metal chains unspooling, followed by the high-pitched whine of a hydraulic lift engaging. In the compliance industry, I frequently review logistics manifests and vehicle recovery invoices. I recognize the acoustic signature of a professional repossession. I slipped out of bed, walked to the window, and parted the blinds just a fraction of an inch. A flatbed tow truck sat idling in the street, its amber lights disabled to maintain the element of surprise. The operator had expertly reversed up the driveway, hooked the front axle of Natalie's pristine luxury sport utility vehicle, and lifted it off the pavement. It took less than 60 seconds. The tow truck pulled away, dragging the glossy symbol of Natalie's fake event planning business into the dark. When morning arrived, the driveway was empty. I sat at the quartz island, sipping my coffee, waiting for the performance. Natalie wandered into the kitchen around 9 o'clock, dressed in expensive athleisure wear. She glanced out the window, then looked at her phone, feigning a look of mild annoyance. She poured herself a glass of water and turned to me, offering a rehearsed sigh. "The dealership came and picked up my car early this morning," she said, waving her hand in a dismissive gesture. "There was a recall on the transmission sensor. They promised to drop off a loaner vehicle by tomorrow afternoon." It is such a profound inconvenience when you have client meetings to attend. She lied with the same effortless fluidity her mother utilized. A woman whose shell company was drowning in casino debt wanted me to believe a luxury dealership executed a stealth vehicle swap at 2 a.m. I offered her a sympathetic nod. I told her I hoped the dealership resolved the mechanical issue quickly. I did not mention the tow truck. I did not mention the chains. I let her wear her fragile illusion for a few more hours, knowing the loaner vehicle would never arrive. The repossession was merely a symptom of the underlying disease. The true desperation surfaced 2 evenings later. I returned home from my auditing firm carrying my briefcase and a folder of client files. The house was unnervingly quiet. Valerie and Natalie were nowhere to be seen, likely hiding in the guest wing to avoid the reality of their situation. Leo was waiting for me in the kitchen. He had prepared dinner. 2 plates of pasta sat on the counter alongside a bottle of cheap wine. The expensive vintages were gone, replaced by whatever he could secure with a high-interest payday loan. He offered me a strained, eager smile. It was the expression of a cornered animal trying to mimic a domesticated pet. He pulled out a bar stool for me, insisting I sit down and relax after a long day at the office. I took my seat, keeping my briefcase resting against my leg. I knew an ambush was imminent. "Idana," he began, keeping his voice low and soothing. "We need to have a serious conversation about our future. The last few weeks have been incredibly stressful for everyone. My mother is anxious, Natalie is struggling with her transportation issues, and I feel like there is a wall between us." I twirled a forkful of pasta, maintaining a neutral expression. I asked him what he proposed to fix the situation. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the counter. He launched into a profound exercise in psychological manipulation. He claimed my stubbornness regarding the household finances was the root cause of our marital friction. He suggested that my refusal to merge our resources and pay Valerie the requested rent had created a toxic environment. He spun a narrative where I was the hoarding, uncooperative wife and he was the exhausted peacemaker trying to save his family from ruin. It was a breathtaking inversion of reality. The man who forged my signature to steal $150,000 was sitting across from me, blaming my financial boundaries for his impending federal crimes. "However, we can fix this together," he said, reaching into his suit jacket. He pulled out a thick, cream-colored envelope and placed it next to my wine glass. "I consulted with a financial advisor today. He suggested a household budgeting consolidation plan. It is a legal restructuring tool. It will allow us to pool our liabilities, lower our collective tax burden, and secure a much better interest rate on our existing debts." He pushed a silver pen across the quartz island, leaving it resting beside the envelope. "All you need to do is sign the authorization," he urged, his eyes wide with manufactured sincerity. "My mother has agreed to act as the primary guarantor for the new consolidated loan, given her excellent credit history. It will take all the pressure off you, Idana. We can finally breathe again." I did not touch the pen. I reached for the cream-colored envelope, lifted the flap, and extracted the document inside. I did not read it like a wife hoping for a resolution. I read it like an underwriter examining a hostile contract. The header was printed in bold, undeniable lettering. It did not say, "Budgeting Consolidation Plan." It said, "Quitclaim Deed." The legal mechanics of a quitclaim deed are simple and devastating. It is a formal instrument used to transfer any interest claim or title a person holds in a piece of real estate to another party. It offers no warranties. It guarantees nothing. If a homeowner signs a quitclaim, they forfeit their ownership rights entirely, but they remain legally responsible for the underlying mortgage attached to the property. I scanned the specified fields. The grantor listed on the document was Idana Cooper. The grantee, the recipient of the property, was Valerie. The sheer audacity of the scheme crystallized in my mind. The fraudulent home equity line of credit was maxed out. Leo's accounts were frozen. The casino bookmakers were closing in on his mother. They had exhausted every available drop of liquid capital. They needed a second massive injection of cash to cover the defaults and keep themselves out of prison. Because the first loan was fraudulent, they could not return to the same credit union. They needed a new lender. But a new lender would require a clean title search and a willing applicant. Leo's plan was diabolical. He wanted me to voluntarily sign away my house, transferring the deed to Valerie. Once Valerie owned the property on paper, she could walk into a different bank, use the house as collateral, and pull out a second legitimate mortgage. They would use that new cash to pay off the forged HELOC, effectively erasing the evidence of their initial felony. And I would be left paying the original $3,000 monthly mortgage on a house I no longer owned, while they lived in the guest wing, funded by a fresh pile of stolen cash. I looked up from the document. Leo was holding his breath, watching my face for any sign of compliance. He was banking on my supposed ignorance of real estate law. He thought the intimidating legal jargon would confuse me into submission. I aligned the edges of the paper, slid the quitclaim deed back into its cream-colored envelope, and placed it gently on the counter. I picked up the silver pen and handed it directly back to my husband. "I am afraid I cannot accommodate this request, Leo," I said, my voice as calm and flat as a frozen lake. "I make it a strict personal policy to never sign binding legal documents without allowing my attorney to review the clauses. I will pass this consolidation plan along to her office tomorrow morning." The color drained from Leo's face in an instant. The artificial warmth he had projected vanished, replaced by a cold gray pallor. A bead of sweat formed at his temple, catching the light of the kitchen pendants. He knew that if an attorney looked at that document, the predatory nature of the transfer would be exposed immediately. He knew his final, desperate escape hatch had just been welded shut. "You do not trust me?" he whispered, his voice cracking under the weight of his collapsing scheme. "Trust is an administrative function," Leo the First replied, standing up from the bar stool and picking up my briefcase. "And right now, the numbers do not balance." I walked out of the kitchen, leaving him staring at the unsigned paper. The smoke screen was gone. The polite requests for rent were a distant memory. We were standing in the wreckage of a heist gone wrong. They were trapped inside the very house they tried to steal, suffocating beneath a mountain of debt they secretly created. They believed they held the ultimate trump card, assuming Valerie's prolonged stay in the guest wing granted her unbreakable residential squatter rights. They thought it would take me months to legally evict them. They were entirely unaware that I had already spent hours inside the county property archives, unearthing a fatal mistake Valerie made weeks ago, a mistake that handed me the keys to an immediate, brutal eviction. The morning following Leo's failed attempt to secure my signature on the property deed brought a new, distinct flavor of tension to the house. The atmosphere was no longer just strained. It felt brittle, like ice ready to fracture under the slightest pressure. Leo left for his regional sales route before dawn, unable to look me in the eye over a cup of coffee. He was a man running out of runway, fleeing the scene of his own collapsing scheme. I took the day off from my firm, claiming a lingering migraine, though my mind had never been sharper. I needed uninterrupted time to assemble the final pieces of documentation for my attorney. Before I locked myself in my home office, I walked downstairs to refill my water glass. As I approached the main landing, I heard the murmur of polite conversation drifting from the formal dining room. I paused, keeping my footsteps light against the hardwood floor. Valerie was entertaining guests. Our next-door neighbors, an older, retired couple named the Hendersons, had stopped by to drop off a misdelivered package. Valerie had invited them inside and was currently holding court at the center of the room. She was wearing a crisp linen blouse, projecting the image of a gracious, affluent host. They were seated around my dining table. This was not a generic piece of furniture purchased from a retail showroom. The table was solid, dark cherry wood, featuring intricate hand-carved legs and a polished surface that held decades of history. It belonged to my grandmother Vera. Vera was a stoic, relentless woman who worked as a bookkeeper for 40 years. She taught me how to balance a ledger with a pencil and how to read the hidden stories written in profit margins. When she passed away, the table was the only physical item I requested from her estate. It was a tangible reminder of the discipline required to build a stable life. I stood in the shadow of the hallway and listened to Valerie's performance. She trailed her manicured fingers across the gleaming cherry wood, offering the Hendersons a wistful, manufactured smile. "We just love having a proper space to entertain," Valerie said, her voice dripping with artificial warmth. "Leo and I agree that preserving the family property is so important. Gathering around our heirloom pieces really grounds the household." She was looking right at the scratches on the wood where my grandmother used to rest her adding machine, and she was claiming the heritage as her own. It was a calculated performance designed to establish a narrative of ownership in front of witnesses. She wanted the neighborhood to view her not as a temporary guest, but as the reigning matriarch of the estate. A younger version of myself might have walked into the room, interrupted the tea service, and corrected the record. I would have felt the burning need to defend my grandmother's legacy from a thief. But an auditor does not argue with a suspect in the middle of a delusion. An auditor allows the suspect to keep talking, knowing every word they speak is just another entry in the evidence log. I offered a brief, polite wave to the Hendersons from the doorway, filled my water glass in the kitchen, and retreated to my office without saying a single word to Valerie. Her brazen entitlement was merely a symptom of her desperation. I locked my office door, sat at my desk, and woke my computer screen. I needed to ensure my attorney possessed every possible weapon before we initiated the final strike. The forged credit union statement proved the financial theft. The frozen joint checking account guaranteed Leo's impending default. But the physical extraction of Valerie and Natalie from the guest wing presented a unique logistical hurdle. In the state of Georgia, removing an entrenched resident can be a grueling bureaucratic ordeal. Even if the individual pays no rent and possesses no formal lease establishing a pattern of residency, grants them significant legal protections. If I filed a standard eviction notice, Valerie could demand a court hearing. She could drag the process out for months, claiming she had a verbal agreement to remain on the premises. She could live in my guest wing, draining the electricity and glaring at me across the kitchen, while a judge slowly reviewed the docket. I refused to endure a 6-month siege in my own home. I logged into the county clerk's digital property portal. I needed to verify that Leo had not managed to file any other predatory liens against my parcel number before his access to capital was severed. I typed in my property identification number and paid the requisite search fee. The database generated a list of all recorded documents tied to my address. The original deed bearing my name was present. The fraudulent secondary loan was listed, securing its dark cloud over my title. But there was a third document, recorded just 4 weeks ago. It was categorized under the miscellaneous filings section, labeled simply as a leasehold agreement. I clicked the link, downloaded the attached digital file, and opened the document on my screen. I scanned the first page, anticipating a standard residential lease. Perhaps Valerie had forged a generic rental contract to preemptively defend herself against an eviction, aiming to solidify her status as a protected tenant. She had forged a lease, but she had not used a residential template. Valerie's past experience as a legal secretary must have given her a false sense of superiority. She thought she was executing a brilliant, multi-layered corporate strategy. The document displayed on my monitor was a formal commercial lease agreement. I read the designated parties. The listed landlord was Idana Cooper, featuring another expertly forged replica of my signature at the bottom of the page. The designated tenant was not Valerie. The tenant occupying the guest wing was listed as Crescent Holdings LLC. The strategy behind this specific forgery illuminated itself immediately. Valerie was not just trying to establish squatter rights. She was trying to legitimize her shadow corporation. To wire massive sums of money to offshore gaming sites, financial institutions require the sender to pass strict verification protocols. A limited liability company needs a verified physical address, a documented lease, and proof of operational overhead to avoid triggering federal money laundering alarms. Valerie had drafted a commercial lease to prove to the casinos and the banks that Crescent Holdings was a legitimate business operating out of a leased corporate suite. She stipulated a monthly commercial rent of $1,000, the exact amount she tried to coerce me into paying her, likely to create a fake paper trail of business expenses for tax purposes. She thought she was a legal mastermind. She thought she had built an impenetrable fortress of paperwork, but her arrogance had blinded her to a fundamental reality of real estate law. I leaned back in my desk chair and let a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. The law treats families and corporations very differently. A residential tenant is viewed as a vulnerable individual, requiring the protection of the court to prevent sudden homelessness. Because of this, residential evictions require lengthy notice periods, formal summons, and extended grace periods. A commercial tenant is viewed as a sophisticated business entity. The law assumes a corporation understands the contracts it signs and the risks it assumes. Commercial leases offer virtually zero statutory protections for the tenant. In Georgia, the eviction process for a commercial entity is swift, unforgiving, and brutal. By listing her shell company as the primary tenant to facilitate her gambling addiction, Valerie had accidentally stripped herself of every single residential protection the state offered. She was no longer a mother-in-law overstaying her welcome. She was a defaulted corporate entity, illegally occupying commercial space. Furthermore, the mechanics of a commercial default are strictly enforced. The forged lease stipulated that Crescent Holdings LLC must remit rent on the first of the month. Because I had frozen the joint checking account and Leo's funds were entirely inaccessible, Crescent Holdings had zero operating capital. They had not paid the fictitious rent they promised in their own forged contract. They were in breach of their own fake lease. When a commercial tenant breaches a contract in this jurisdiction, the landlord is not required to wait months for a hearing. The landlord can issue a formal demand for possession. If the tenant does not vacate immediately, the landlord can file a commercial dispossessory warrant. The court processes these warrants with extreme prejudice. Upon approval, a sheriff is dispatched. The tenant is given a mere 3 days to pack their assets. If they fail to comply, the authorities physically remove them, and the landlord changes the locks. Valerie had tried to build a labyrinth, but she had accidentally handed me the map, the sword, and the exit key. She forged the exact instrument I needed to bypass the agonizing delays of family court and housing court. I pressed the print command on my keyboard. The laser printer in the corner of my office whirred to life, spitting out crisp, warm pages of the commercial lease agreement. I gathered the paper, aligning the edges with a sharp tap against the mahogany desk. The trap was fully set. The fraudulent loan provided the leverage against Leo. The frozen accounts provided the financial asphyxiation. And now the forged commercial lease provided the mechanism for a rapid legal extraction. They were out of money, out of time, and out of legal shields. I slipped the printed commercial lease into my leather briefcase, resting it right next to the bank records and the notary evidence. I checked my wristwatch. It was early afternoon. I had plenty of time to drive back downtown and deliver this final piece of artillery to Naomi's desk. The time for quiet observation was over. The audit was complete. It was time to issue the final findings. I navigated the afternoon traffic toward the financial district, my leather portfolio resting on the passenger seat. The commercial lease agreement tucked inside felt heavier than a simple stack of printer paper. It was the keystone that would bring the entire fraudulent architecture crashing down. Naomi Vance sat behind her polished mahogany desk, framed by panoramic windows overlooking the harbor. I handed her the freshly printed document without a preamble. She adjusted her wire-rimmed spectacles, her eyes scanning the forged paragraphs. The unbroken quiet in her office was punctuated only by the crisp rustle of turning pages. Naomi does not traffic in pity. She deals exclusively in leverage. When she reached the final signature line detailing Crescent Holdings as the primary tenant, a sharp, predatory smile touched the corners of her mouth. She tapped a manicured fingernail against the counterfeit notary seal. "This is no longer just a boundary dispute," she stated, her tone carrying the clinical detachment of a surgeon preparing an incision. "This is felony bank fraud, and your mother-in-law just handed us the eviction loophole, wrapped in a neat bow." We spent the next 2 hours drafting the instruments of their destruction. I did not want to rely on the subjective empathy of a family court judge. Sympathy is fickle. Mathematics and statutory violations are undeniable. We prepared a sworn affidavit of forgery, a legally binding declaration that stripped my liability from the 6-figure credit line. The document formally accused Leo of manufacturing my consent. Naomi constructed a quiet title action to scrub the predatory claims from my property record, ensuring my newly formed blind trust remained unassailable. Finally, we drafted the most crucial weapon, a formal 3-day notice to quit for a commercial eviction. Because Valerie classified her shell company as the occupying entity, we bypassed the agonizing delays of residential squatter protections. The paperwork transformed my stolen guest wing from a disputed home into a defaulted commercial suite. Naomi sealed the forgery evidence into a thick courier package, directing it straight to the secondary lender's internal fraud division. We were not merely defending my assets. We were laying a perimeter of paper traps, setting charges at every structural support of Leo's deception. I shook Naomi's hand and rode the elevator down to the lobby. The legal machinery was officially in motion. I was not asking a judge to feel sorry for me. I was handing the court a weaponized ledger. The evening sun cast long golden shadows across my driveway as I returned to the neighborhood. I unlocked the front door and stepped into the foyer, expecting the usual oppressive tension of a household holding its breath. Instead, the rich aroma of seared ribeye and roasted garlic drifted from the kitchen. I walked down the hall and found Leo unpacking several heavy insulated bags from the most expensive steakhouse in the county. It was the same establishment where his debit card had been declined just days prior. He had arranged a lavish spread on the quartz island, complete with a fresh bottle of imported Cabernet. When he saw me, he offered a bright, overly enthusiastic greeting. He pulled out a stool, poured a generous glass of wine, and launched into a monologue about how much he appreciated my hard work. He kissed my cheek, playing the part of a devoted, loving partner. To an untrained observer, it looked like a romantic gesture. To an auditor, it was the classic tell of a suspect attempting to mask their tracks. His joint accounts were frozen solid. His credit line was tapped out. The luxury vehicle leased by his sister was gone. Yet he stood in my kitchen, serving a meal that cost hundreds of dollars. The math refused to align. There was only one logical explanation for this sudden influx of cash. He had visited a high-interest payday lender, trading his future earning potential for a handful of immediate currency. He was burning the floorboards to keep the house warm. The exaggerated affection was a shield. He knew the secondary lender was hunting for their missed $3,000 minimum payment. He knew the default algorithms were churning in the background. The storm was gathering on the horizon, and he was desperately trying to secure my loyalty before the lightning struck. He hoped that a warm meal and a few compliments would soften the blow when the truth inevitably shattered our living room. He wanted me docile, compliant, and ready to open my checkbook when the bank finally knocked on our door. I sat at the island and accepted the wine. I tasted the expensive cut of beef, chewing slowly, savoring the profound dramatic irony of the situation. Leo was treating me to a feast funded by predatory debt, unaware that I had just spent the afternoon drafting his criminal referral. He poured more wine, smiling, while a courier navigated across the city to deliver his forged documents to a federal fraud department. He believed he was managing the crisis, orchestrating a clever delay tactic. He did not realize the ground beneath his feet was already gone. I played my role flawlessly. I thanked him for the dinner, offering polite conversation about his day. The tension hummed beneath my skin, an electric current of anticipation. Every time a car drove past the house, his eyes darted toward the window. He was a man waiting for an executioner he could not see. I did not need to confront him over the stake. I did not need to scream about the forged lease. I just needed to let the calendar advance. The banking industry operates on strict, unforgiving timelines. 30 days of delinquency triggers an automated response. A piece of certified mail was already winding its way through the postal system, carrying a formal declaration of his failure. The paper trap was set, and the bait was taken. All I had to do was wait quietly in my fortress for the mail carrier to trigger the mechanism, forcing the collision they had spent weeks trying to avoid. The eve of the 30th day descended upon the neighborhood with the suffocating humidity typical of a coastal Georgia summer. The financial ecosystem I had carefully severed was reaching its critical expiration date. I stood in the darkened master bedroom, gazing through the plantation shutters toward the backyard. The landscaping lights cast long, distorted shadows across the manicured lawn. Leo was pacing the perimeter of the grass. The glowing screen of his cellular phone illuminated his features, painting his face in a harsh, pale light. He held the device close to his mouth, whispering frantically into the receiver. His movements were erratic, devoid of the confident swagger he usually projected. He would stop, run a trembling hand through his hair, and resume his frantic marching. He was a cornered animal, searching for an exit that did not exist. I knew exactly who he was talking to. He was pleading with customer service representatives, begging automated banking systems for an extension, or perhaps negotiating with another predatory payday lender. He was trying to buy time. But time in the financial sector is a commodity you cannot purchase on credit. The midnight deadline was approaching, and his accounts remained locked behind the impenetrable wall I had constructed. I watched him pace for another 20 minutes before returning to bed, enjoying a deep, uninterrupted sleep. The following afternoon, the theoretical deadline transformed into a physical reality. I was working from my home office when the doorbell chimed. I walked to the foyer and opened the heavy oak door. The regular postal carrier stood on the porch, holding an electronic signature pad and a thick, rigid cardboard envelope. The postage indicated it was sent via certified mail, requiring direct recipient verification. I glanced at the return address printed in stark, unyielding typography in the upper left corner. It was the Secondary Credit Union, the institution holding the forged home equity line of credit. I signed my name on the digital pad, accepted the envelope, and closed the door. The parcel felt heavy in my hands, carrying the weight of a six-figure default. I did not open it. I knew exactly what the document inside contained. It was the formal notice of default, the legal declaration that the required $3,000 payment had bounced, and the lender was initiating the preliminary stages of asset recovery. I walked into the kitchen and placed the certified envelope dead center on the quartz island. I arranged it meticulously, ensuring the embossed logo of the credit union was highly visible. It sat there like a loaded weapon resting on a velvet cushion. I brewed a fresh cup of dark roast coffee, walked into the living room, and sat in my grandmother's armchair. I opened a hardcover book and waited for the collision. Leo arrived home just after 5 o'clock. The front door clicked shut, followed by the heavy thud of his leather briefcase hitting the floorboards. I heard his footsteps pause in the kitchen. A prolonged, suffocating silence echoed through the house. Then came the distinct, ragged sound of thick paper tearing. He had ripped the certified envelope open. A sharp, breathless gasp followed the sound of a man absorbing a fatal blow. Heavy, panicked footsteps scrambled across the kitchen tiles, sprinting frantically down the hallway toward the guest wing. He was retrieving his mother. The hushed, urgent tones of their voices bled through the drywall, a chaotic symphony of panic and recrimination. The illusion of their affluent independence was shattering in real time. A minute later, they entered the living room. They moved as a unit, flanking my armchair, effectively cornering me in my own space. The transformation in Valerie was staggering. The polished, condescending matriarch had vanished entirely. Her designer blouse looked rumpled, her posture was hunched, and her eyes were wide, darting erratically around the room. The polite, manufactured warmth she usually weaponized was gone, replaced by raw, visceral terror. She was a woman staring down the barrel of federal fraud charges and bankruptcy, realizing her safety net had disintegrated. Leo stood beside her, holding the crumpled notice of default in his shaking fist. He looked at me, his chest heaving, as he struggled to draw breath. He did not attempt to maintain his arrogant facade. He took a staggering step forward and dropped to his knees right on the hardwood floor. The physical act of submission was jarring. A man who demanded I pay rent to his mother a month ago was now kneeling at my feet, his expensive suit trousers collecting dust from the rug. "Idana, you have to help us," he pleaded, his voice cracking into a high, desperate register. "I made a terrible mistake. I made a series of bad investments. The market shifted and my portfolio collapsed. I took out a loan to cover the margins, and now the bank is threatening to take the house. They are going to foreclose on our home." He was weeping, genuine tears spilling over his eyelashes. Yet even on his knees, staring at financial ruin, he continued to lie. He spun a tragic tale of business miscalculations and economic downturns. He omitted the offshore gaming sites. He omitted the casino debts. He omitted the forged notary seal and the criminal theft of my equity. He wanted me to believe he was a victim of circumstance, hoping my empathy would override my logic. "Please," he begged, reaching out to grasp the armrest of my chair. "You have a substantial balance in your retirement portfolio. You have to liquidate your 401k. If you drain the retirement account, we can cover the arrears and pay off the principal. We can save the family. I will pay you back every single cent, I promise. You just have to sign the withdrawal authorization tonight." The audacity was breathtaking. Having exhausted the stolen equity, his immediate proposed solution was to gut my retirement savings, destroying my future stability to plug the hole in his sinking ship. He viewed my lifelong discipline solely as an emergency fund for his criminal negligence. I did not flinch. I did not lean away from his grasping hands. I kept my posture relaxed, holding my ceramic coffee mug in my lap. I looked down at my husband, observing his tears with the clinical detachment of a researcher studying a predictable chemical reaction. "I am afraid that is impossible, Leo," I stated, my voice echoing evenly in the quiet room. He stared up at me, blinking away the moisture. "Why?" he choked out, his voice barely a whisper. "We will lose everything." "You are assuming I have access to liquid capital," I replied, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my coffee. "But the joint checking accounts have been frozen for a month." The silence that descended upon the living room was absolute. It was a dense, heavy quiet, the kind of stillness that follows a bomb detonating far in the distance right before the shockwave hits. Leo stopped breathing. His hands slowly slipped off the armrest of my chair, falling limply to his sides. The gears in his mind ground together, piecing the timeline into a horrifying picture. He remembered his debit card declining at the steakhouse. He remembered the utility shutoffs. He remembered the automated payment rejections. He had spent the last 30 days assuming he was the victim of a catastrophic bank glitch or an aggressive collections algorithm. Looking into my calm, unyielding eyes, the truth finally penetrated his denial. It was not a glitch, it was an execution. "You froze the accounts," he whispered, the realization hitting him with the force of a physical blow. "You knew the payment was due. You intentionally starved the balance." "I did," I confirmed softly. The realization that their golden goose had deliberately, systematically engineered their starvation shattered whatever remained of his sanity. He slumped backward, sitting on his heels, staring at me as if I were a stranger wearing his wife's face. He finally understood that he was not managing a crisis. He was trapped inside a snare I had meticulously woven around him. Valerie, however, possessed none of her son's defeated realization. The admission ignited a volatile, vicious rage inside her. She lunged forward, her face twisting into a grotesque mask of fury. "You selfish, vindictive monster!" she shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly off the vaulted ceilings. Her hands curled into tight claws at her sides. "After everything we have done to embrace you, you would sit there and watch your own husband drown? You are destroying my son. You are hoarding wealth while your family faces the street. You are a cold, unfeeling machine." She spat the insults like venom, trying to invoke guilt, trying to shame me into submission. She believed volume and righteous indignation could reverse the mathematics of the situation. I slowly placed my coffee mug on the side table. I looked at the woman who had replaced my espresso, intercepted my mail, and forged a commercial lease to legitimize her gambling addiction. "I am not destroying your son, Valerie," I replied, my tone flat and final. "Your offshore casino markers destroyed your son. I am simply refusing to pay the invoice." Her jaw snapped shut. The mention of the casinos stripped her of her remaining ammunition. The secret she had buried beneath tailored slacks and floral perfume was laid bare on the living room rug. She looked at Leo, waiting for him to defend her, but Leo remained motionless on the floor, paralyzed by the collapse of their shared delusion. Since you are both acutely aware of the financial constraints we are currently facing, I continued, smoothing the fabric of my skirt, I highly advise you to figure out how to generate some immediate capital. Because the commercial rent for the guest wing is past due, and the landlord is no longer granting extensions. I picked up my book, opened it to my bookmarked page, and began to read, effectively dismissing them from my presence. Valerie stood trembling, vibrating with a frantic, impotent rage. She realized tears and threats were useless currencies in this room. She grabbed Leo by the shoulder, hauling him up from the floor. She dragged him toward the hallway, muttering feverishly under her breath. She was defeated in the private arena, but a narcissist rarely surrenders after a single loss. If she could not break me in the quiet isolation of our home, she would seek a larger audience. As they retreated to the guest wing, I heard her sharp, calculating voice drifting down the corridor, instructing Leo to call his aunts and uncles. She was assembling a tribunal. She intended to drag me in front of the extended family, preparing to weaponize public shame in a desperate bid to force my hand before the weekend was over. The weekend crept forward with the heavy impending dread of a scheduled execution. By Sunday afternoon, the atmosphere inside my home had shifted from frantic panic to calculated theatricality. Valerie spent the morning cleaning the formal dining room, dusting the chandelier, and arranging the chairs around my grandmother's cherry wood table. She moved with the rigid determination of a battlefield commander preparing a final, desperate defensive line. She was organizing a psychological ambush, leveraging the only currency she had left, public shame. In Leo's family, unity was the highest virtue, which invariably meant sacrificing individual boundaries to protect the collective image. Dissent was handled through coordinated guilt. If a member stepped out of line, the elders were summoned to correct the behavior. I knew exactly what was coming. At 4 o'clock, the doorbell chimed. I remained in my home office, listening to the hushed, urgent whispers echoing from the foyer. Leo greeted his Uncle Kenneth and his Aunt Diane. They were the unofficial patriarch and matriarch of the extended bloodline, respected for their strict adherence to traditional family values. Following close behind them was Leo's older cousin Paul, a man who mirrored Leo's arrogant posture. The whispers in the hallway were frantic, setting the stage, priming the jury before the defendant even entered the courtroom. I waited 10 minutes, allowing them to settle, before I walked into the dining room. The conversation halted the moment my shoes crossed the threshold. Kenneth and Diane sat on the far side of the table, their expressions carved from stone. They offered tight, humorless nods in my direction. Paul stared at his phone, refusing to meet my gaze. Valerie directed me to a chair at the opposite end of the table, isolating me from the group. It was a classic interrogation tactic, designed to make the target feel outnumbered and physically cornered. I took my seat, smoothing the fabric of my dress, and waited for the performance to begin. The first distinct shift in their reality arrived on the dinner plates. During previous family gatherings, my income had funded lavish spreads. I used to serve prime rib, imported cheeses, and bottles of premium vintage wine. Those days were over. The financial drought had reached the kitchen. Valerie walked out of the pantry carrying a large glass baking dish. She set it in the center of the table. It was a dense baked pasta casserole covered in a thick layer of generic processed cheese. She spooned a portion onto my plate. The food was lukewarm, the noodles starchy and pale. Instead of wine, Leo poured inexpensive tap water into the crystal goblets. The stark contrast between the elegant dining room and the cheap, uninspired meal was palpable. The poverty they were experiencing was sitting right there on their forks. Yet Kenneth and Diane ate in polite silence, ignorant of the underlying cause. They had been fed a narrative where I was a hoarding, uncooperative wife. They believed the lukewarm casserole was a direct result of my sudden, inexplicable greed. I chewed the dense pasta, noting the irony. My stolen equity had funded luxury vehicles and casino markers, leaving them with nothing but processed cheese for a Sunday dinner. The dishes were cleared, and the true purpose of the gathering commenced. Leo pushed his chair back and stood up. The room fell into a reverent silence. He looked exhausted, his shoulders slumped, playing the role of the weary martyr burdened by an impossible situation. He looked at Kenneth, then at Diane, and finally at me. "This has been the hardest month of my life," Leo began, his voice trembling with a carefully manufactured vulnerability. "I have tried to shield this family from the stress. I have tried to carry the weight alone, but I am breaking." He paused, allowing the gravity of his words to settle over the relatives. He wove a masterful tragic fiction. He described a sudden, unforeseen collapse in his sales territory. He detailed Natalie losing her event planning contracts due to market shifts. He painted a heartbreaking picture of his mother facing housing insecurity, forcing him to move them into the guest wing to save them from the street. He was crying now. Genuine tears tracked down his cheeks, a testament to his sheer terror of the impending bank default. But he directed all that terror outward, shaping it into a weapon aimed directly at my chest. And instead of supporting us, Leo choked out, pointing a trembling finger in my direction. "Idana has turned her back on this marriage. She froze our joint accounts. She locked me out of our shared finances. She is sitting on a massive retirement portfolio, hoarding her wealth while my mother faces homelessness. She is deliberately starving us out to prove a point." Valerie dabbed her eyes with a linen napkin, emitting a soft, wounded sob. Natalie stared down at her lap, playing the devastated, helpless sister. The theatricality of the moment was flawless. They had convicted me in the court of public opinion without presenting a single piece of hard evidence. The jury delivered their verdict immediately. Aunt Diane leaned forward, her face twisted in profound disappointment. "Marriage is a partnership in the eyes of God, Idana," she scolded, her tone dripping with righteous indignation. "When Leo struggles, you struggle. You do not lock your purse and watch your family drown. Your behavior is cruel." Uncle Kenneth crossed his arms, staring at me with cold authority. "I never thought I would see the day a wife treats her husband like a financial burden," he added, his voice low and threatening. "Leo has worked his fingers to the bone for you. You owe this family your loyalty. You need to fix this right now before the damage is permanent." The pressure in the room was immense. The psychological weight of 5 adults projecting shame, guilt, and fury onto one person is designed to crack the human spirit. They expected me to break. They expected me to cry, to apologize, to scramble for a defense against their unified front. They wanted me overwhelmed by the social isolation, desperate to buy my way back into their good graces. Leo seized the momentum. He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and produced the cream-colored envelope from 2 nights ago. He walked around the table and slid the document across the cherry wood, letting it rest right next to my water glass. It was the quitclaim deed. "We can restructure the debt," Leo urged, hovering over my chair, his voice adopting a soothing, coercive cadence. "We found a lender willing to consolidate everything under my mother's name, but the bank needs the title clear. You just need to sign this deed, Idana. Transfer the equity to Valerie, and the new loan will save this house. Prove to this family that you are committed to our survival." He placed the silver pen on top of the document. The room held its collective breath. Kenneth and Diane watched me expectantly, waiting for my capitulation. Valerie gripped the edge of the table, her knuckles white with anticipation. In a corporate audit, when a department head realizes they are caught, they often call a large, crowded meeting. They attempt to spread the blame among their subordinates, using the sheer volume of voices to drown out the facts. This Sunday dinner was Leo's all-staff meeting. I did not reach for the pen. I did not raise my voice to defend myself. I sat perfectly still in my grandmother's chair, maintaining a cool, unblinking gaze. I let the silence stretch out long and uncomfortable. I let them sit in the tension they created. I allowed them to dig their hole as deep as possible, ensuring every relative in the room was fully committed to the narrative before I dismantled it. The quiet stretched for a full 60 seconds. The smug anticipation on Valerie's face began to falter, replaced by a flickering doubt. Leo shifted his weight, unsettled by my refusal to engage with his emotional performance. When the silence became unbearable, I finally moved. I reached down to the floor beside my chair, where my structured leather tote rested. I opened the brass clasp and reached inside. I bypassed my wallet and my phone. My fingers found the smooth, cool surface of a thick manila folder. I pulled the folder out and set it on the cherry wood table, placing it directly on top of the quitclaim deed. If the family is making financial decisions, I announced, my voice flat and even, echoing clearly through the dining room, we should all be looking at the same ledger. The silence inside the formal dining room transformed from expectant anticipation into a thick, confused tension. Uncle Kenneth frowned, his heavy gray eyebrows knitting together over the bridge of his nose. He was a man accustomed to blind obedience from younger relatives, entirely unused to a defendant bringing visual aids to an emotional sentencing. Aunt Diane shifted uncomfortably in her seat, sensing the sudden drop in the atmospheric pressure. I opened the plain manila folder. I did not rush the process. I dealt the printed pages onto the polished cherry wood surface with the fluid mechanical precision of a blackjack dealer distributing cards at a high-stakes table. I arranged the documents in a neat chronological sequence, ensuring the bold headers and bank logos faced outward for maximum legibility to the assembled jury. Natalie, sensing the immediate threat to her subsidized existence, leaned forward. She had spent her entire adulthood skimming off the top of her mother's manipulations, navigating life under the assumption that other people existed solely to cushion her failures. She was accustomed to taking whatever she desired without resistance. Her hand darted out across the table, her manicured fingers extending to snatch the top document before anyone could process the text. I anticipated the maneuver. I brought my palm down flat against the paper, pinning it to the wood with a sharp, resonant slap that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. I locked eyes with my sister-in-law. I did not blink. I applied downward pressure, holding her gaze until the defiant spark in her eyes flickered and died. The silent confrontation lasted only a few seconds, but the hierarchy of the room was permanently realigned. She shrank back into her chair, pulling her hand away as if the paper had burned her skin, crossing her arms in a defensive posture. I lifted my hand and tapped the center of the first page. Let us review the actual financial hardship plaguing this household. I began adopting the clinical, unyielding cadence of a boardroom compliance presentation. This is a monthly statement from a regional secondary lending institution. It outlines a home equity line of credit. The total principal extended on this account is $150,000. The available balance is entirely exhausted. I slid the document toward the center of the table, so Kenneth and Diane could clearly see the figures printed in black and white. I continued tracing the paper trail, keeping my voice steady. You will notice the designated collateral securing this staggering liability is the very house we are currently sitting inside, a property I purchased independently, utilizing my own premarital funds years before I met my husband. If you examine the second page of the contract, you will find the signature of the primary deed holder authorizing the lien. I pointed to the bottom of the page, tracing the ink with my index finger. That is supposed to be my signature. I assure you, it is an utter fabrication. I was conducting a corporate supply chain audit in a different city on the exact date this instrument was executed. Diane squinted at the paper, her initial righteous anger giving way to genuine creeping bewilderment. But there is an official seal right next to the name, she pointed out, her voice losing its sharp, authoritative edge. The bank would never accept it without verification. I nodded, offering a tight, humorless smile. Yes, there is. A digital stamp verifying the identities of the signatories under penalty of perjury. I retrieved the state registry printout and placed it directly next to the loan document. And this is the public commission record for that specific seal. It belongs to an old colleague of Valerie, a former legal secretary willing to bypass state identification laws and apply a corrupt authentication for a friend. My husband leveraged my equity, and his mother provided the forged notary seal to bypass the bank's security protocols. The air in the room grew incredibly heavy, suffocating the manufactured narrative Leo had spun just moments ago. Kenneth turned his head slowly, looking at his nephew with a newly formed, horrifying realization. The posture of the esteemed family patriarch began to crumble. But a stolen credit line is only the beginning of the forensic audit I pressed on refusing to grant them a single second to recover their composure. The most important question is always where the money went. Leo claims he suffered catastrophic business losses in his sales territory. He claims Natalie lost her event planning contracts due to market shifts. I slid the banking ledgers and the wire transfer receipts into the center of the arrangement, forming a neat, undeniable grid of evidence. These are the routing numbers tied to Crescent Holdings, I explained, tapping the top ledger. A domestic shell corporation registered by Valerie. The stolen equity was deposited directly into this entity. And these pages detail the outgoing expenditures. I walked the captive audience through the math, reading the transactions out loud to ensure no one could ignore the reality. $12,000 wired to an offshore digital casino based in a foreign jurisdiction. $18,000 sent to a regional gaming resort located just a few hours north of this city. $3,000 drafted monthly to cover the lease on a luxury sport utility vehicle that was recently repossessed in the middle of the night. I squared the edges of the receipts, aligning them perfectly. There were no business losses. There were no noble sacrifices made to keep this family afloat. Leo committed felony bank fraud to subsidize his mother's undisclosed gambling addiction. To protect this scheme, I added pulling the final document from the folder Valerie recorded this fraudulent commercial lease against my residential deed. She attempted to legitimize her shell company to the gaming authorities, inadvertently stripping herself of every residential tenant protection the state of Georgia provides. The illusion shattered. The shards of their respectable, affluent family image rained down upon the dining table, leaving nothing but the ugly, undeniable truth exposed under the chandelier. I picked up the cream-colored envelope containing the quitclaim deed, the very document Leo had tried to force upon me to cover his tracks. I dropped it onto the pile of evidence. "You did not invite me here to save a family," I told the stunned room, squaring my shoulders and looking directly at my husband. "You invited me here to refinance a felony." Aunt Diane gasped, a sharp, ragged sound bringing a trembling hand to cover her mouth. She recoiled from the table, pushing her chair back as if the documents were coated in a lethal toxin. Uncle Kenneth sat rigid, his face turning a dark, apoplectic shade of red as he stared at his sister. The moral high ground they had occupied for decades was swept out from under them in a matter of minutes. The smokescreen evaporated. Stripped of her polite matriarch facade and cornered by the undeniable proof of her addiction, Valerie resorted to the only defense mechanism she had left in her arsenal. She erupted, her face contorted into a mask of desperate, feral fury. She slammed her fists against the cherrywood table, attempting to scream over the evidence resting in front of her. "You owe us!" she shrieked, the sound sharp and guttural, lacking any trace of her former elegance. "We welcomed you into this family. We gave you a name and a place at this table. You have more money in your accounts than you could ever spend, and you are destroying my son over a piece of paper." She wanted to twist the reality, hoping sheer volume and aggressive indignation could somehow defeat logic. She wanted the extended family to view me as the villain for refusing to absorb her debts, but the math stood firm. In a society governed by contracts and credit bureaus, financial crimes carry severe, unyielding consequences. Paper is the only witness that never changes its story, never sheds a tear, and never lies at a Sunday dinner. The ledgers spoke louder than her screams ever could. Leo slumped in his chair, His charming, arrogant posture collapsed inward, leaving a hollow, defeated shell of a man. His shoulders shook, but he made no sound. He buried his face in his hands, utterly unable to look his uncle or his aunt in the eye. The relatives who had marched into my home, ready to condemn a greedy, uncooperative wife, were now staring at a syndicate of thieves with profound, unadulterated horror. The psychological tribunal they designed to break my spirit had backfired with devastating precision. The trial was over. The verdict was reversed. Now the only thing left to deliver was the final sentencing. The sound of my voice faded into the expansive architecture of the formal dining room, leaving a profound ringing silence in its wake. The psychological tribunal Valerie had orchestrated was entirely dismantled, and the jurors were resigning from their posts. Uncle Kenneth was the first to move. He stood up slowly, pushing his heavy wooden chair back from the cherrywood table. The legs scraped harshly against the polished hardwood floor, a grating noise that shattered the remaining tension. He did not yell. He did not offer a dramatic speech. He looked at Valerie with an expression of unadulterated disgust. He buttoned his tailored suit jacket, turned to his wife, and instructed Diane to gather her purse. Aunt Diane obeyed instantly. She kept her eyes fixed firmly on the intricate pattern of the Persian rug, refusing to cast even a passing glance at the woman who had invited her to a sham execution. Paul, the older cousin, followed them out of the dining room without uttering a single syllable. I listened to their swift footsteps retreating down the hallway. The heavy oak front door clicked shut, engaging the deadbolt with a solid metallic thud. The extended family had officially abandoned the sinking ship, sealing the three perpetrators inside the house with their judge. With his captive audience gone, Leo was left without a sympathetic jury to manipulate. The theatrical martyr persona melted away, exposing the fragile, panicked core beneath. He looked at the cooling, processed casserole resting in the center of the table, then slowly brought his eyes up to meet mine. He attempted to pivot his strategy, shifting from righteous indignation to pathetic vulnerability. He wiped a layer of cold sweat from his forehead, using a linen napkin, and offered a stammering, desperate apology. He claimed he had developed a flawless mathematical system to beat the casino algorithms. He insisted the blackjack tables at the regional resort were finally turning in his favor. He spoke in rapid, disjointed sentences, explaining how he just needed one more month of capital to maintain his betting spread. He genuinely believed he was on the precipice of a massive payout that would allow him to replenish the stolen home equity and erase the forged credit line before the bank ever noticed. He was speaking the delusional language of a secondary addict. He had absorbed his mother's sickness so completely that he believed probability could be bullied into submission. He thought he could gamble his way out of a federal felony. I listened to his frantic rationalizations with the clinical detachment of a researcher cataloging a predictable psychological breakdown. He was not apologizing for stealing my identity or violating the sanctity of my home. He was apologizing because the casino math had failed him and he had run out of chips. I did not demand remorse. Remorse is a subjective, emotional transaction, and I was strictly conducting a localized foreclosure. I reached back into my structured leather tote for the final time. I withdrew 2 distinct heavy packets of paper prepared by Naomi Vance. The documents were secured with thick brass binding clips. I set them side by side on the polished table, resting them adjacent to the forged bank statements. I did not ask for explanations. I dictated terms. I outlined their future with absolute chilling clarity, offering 2 distinct paths forward. The first packet resting on your left is a petition for an immediate, uncontested divorce, I explained, keeping my tone as rhythmic and steady as a metronome. Included within those pages is a binding debt assumption agreement. If you sign these documents, Leo, you legally accept 100% of the fraudulent credit line. You formally remove your name from any and all claims to this property, and you walk away with the 6-figure liability you manufactured. We file it with the county clerk in the morning, and we dissolve this marriage quietly. I tapped the second packet. The documents resting on your right contain the sworn affidavit of forgery, the handwriting analysis, and the comprehensive evidence file mapping the offshore wire transfers. If you refuse to sign the divorce petition, my attorney will submit this second packet to the state authorities and the bank fraud division tomorrow morning at exactly 9 o'clock. This action guarantees a federal criminal investigation. The corrupt notary your mother hired will face disbarment and prosecution. Both you and Valerie will face immediate indictment for conspiracy and bank fraud. I leaned back in my grandmother's chair, resting my hands in my lap. 30 days ago, you sat at this exact table and confidently declared that your money was yours, expecting me to subsidize your mother's rent. I am simply enforcing your personal financial philosophy. My money is mine, and your debt is yours. You have until 9 o'clock tomorrow morning to choose your consequence. Leo stared at the 2 stacks of paper. The color drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly ashen gray. His mind struggled to process the ruthless efficiency of the snare I had drawn around his throat. In a final, desperate bid to regain control, he tried to call my bluff. He planted his hands on the table and pushed himself into a standing position, attempting to utilize his physical height to intimidate me. "You are playing a game, Adana," he insisted, his voice shaking with a fragile, hollow bravado. "You are angry, and you have every right to be angry, but you are bluffing. You would never send the man you married to a federal penitentiary. You do not have the stomach to destroy my life over money." I looked up at him. I did not break eye contact. I observed him with the cold stillness of an insurance underwriter rejecting a fraudulent claim. "I already froze your accounts, Leo," I said, my voice dropping to a low, razor-sharp register. "I sat across the kitchen island and watched you eat takeout funded by a predatory payday loan. I watched you sweat every time a delivery truck drove past our window. I listened to your sister cry when the repo man towed her luxury vehicle away in the middle of the night. I watched you drown for a solid month, and I did not throw you a life preserver." I poured myself a glass of wine and enjoyed the silence. "What on earth makes you think I will hesitate to finish the job?" The remaining air evaporated from the dining room. Leo collapsed back into his chair as if the bones in his legs had suddenly dissolved. He had no counter-argument. The realization that I was entirely immune to his manipulation paralyzed his vocal cords. He finally understood the depth of the void he had stepped into. However, Valerie, sensing the absolute destruction of her primary enabler, refused to accept defeat. A narcissist facing exposure will always attempt to find a technicality, a final loophole to exert control over their victim. She straightened her posture, smoothing the wrinkles from her linen blouse. She crossed her arms over her chest and adopted a smug, triumphant smirk. "You can threaten my son with a divorce petition," Valerie declared, her voice dripping with artificial confidence. "You can try to pin this banking error on him, but you cannot throw me into the street." She walked around the table, standing directly behind Leo's chair, placing a protective hand on his shoulder. "I know the law, Adana. I worked in litigation. You invited us to live in this house. We have established permanent residency. We receive mail at this address. We possess ironclad squatter rights under the statutes of this state. If you want me out of that guest wing, you will have to take me to housing court. I will demand a hearing, request continuances, and drag the eviction process out for an entire year. You will have to look at my face every single morning while I live under your roof." She tilted her chin upward, savoring her perceived victory. She believed she had found the ultimate shield. She thought her archaic knowledge of residential tenant protections granted her an unbreakable lease on my sanctuary. She intended to hold my property hostage, using her physical presence to extract future concessions or force a favorable financial settlement. I looked at her smug expression, noting the triumphant gleam in her eyes. I felt a slow, genuine smile spread across my face. She had proudly announced her defensive strategy, completely unaware that she was standing precisely where I needed her to be. She thought she was building a fortress, but she had just engaged the final mechanism of the trap I engineered days ago. I looked at Valerie, observing the triumphant gleam in her eyes. She stood behind her son, her arms crossed over her linen blouse, projecting the arrogance of a woman who believed she had discovered an impenetrable legal shield. She was banking on the notoriously sluggish pace of residential housing courts. She anticipated a year of rent-free living, utilizing the bureaucratic delays of the justice system to extract a settlement from me. She thought she was a legal mastermind, but she had built her entire fortress on a foundation of profound ignorance. I did not raise my voice to argue. I stood up from my grandmother's cherry wood table and walked toward the kitchen. The dining room remained dead silent, the remaining occupants tracking my movements with wary confusion. I approached the quartz island, reached past the cold plates of pasta, and picked up the large tin of cheap dark roast coffee Valerie had purchased with my stolen equity. I turned around, held the tin over the stainless steel trash receptacle, and let it drop. It hit the bottom of the empty bin with a hollow, resonant thud that echoed sharply through the quiet house. I walked back into the dining room and reached into my leather tote for the final time. I retrieved the crisp, laser-printed document I had generated in my office just a few hours prior. I slid it across the polished wood, stopping it directly in front of Valerie's hands. "You are operating under a fundamental misunderstanding of your own forgery, Valerie," I stated my tone, stripping away any remaining pretense of civility. "You assumed you possessed residential squatter rights. But when you decided to legitimize your shell company for your offshore gaming regulators, you made a fatal error." Valerie looked down at the document. Her eyes scanned the bold header at the top of the page. The smug satisfaction began to drain from her features, replaced by a rigid, creeping dread. "Actually, Valerie, you forged a commercial lease," I explained, delivering the legal reality with surgical precision. "You listed Crescent Holdings as the primary tenant to create a fake paper trail of business overhead. As someone who claims to know litigation, you should understand the distinction. Residential tenants receive months of grace and extensive statutory protections to prevent homelessness. Commercial entities receive zero. The law assumes a corporation understands the contracts it signs and the risks it assumes." I rested my hands on the back of my chair, leaning forward just an inch. In the state of Georgia, a defaulted commercial tenant has no residential squatter rights. Since you failed to pay the fictitious commercial rent you stipulated in your own fake contract, you are currently in breach. You do not get a year of hearings and continuances. A commercial dispossessory warrant moves with extreme prejudice. Valerie stared at the paper. Her hands began to tremble. The fortress she thought she constructed had just evaporated into thin air, leaving her standing on a trap door. "You do not have 12 months, I told her, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "You have 3 days. Now get out of my dining room." The ensuing night passed with the quiet intensity of a battlefield awaiting the dawn. I locked my bedroom door and slept soundly, knowing the machinery was locked in motion. Monday morning arrived, bringing a crisp, clear light through the plantation shutters. I dressed in a tailored suit, poured a cup of black tea, and walked into the kitchen. Leo was already sitting at the island. He looked as though he had not slept in a week. His skin was pale, his eyes rimmed with dark bruised shadows. The bravado, the manipulation, the arrogant dismissals, they were all burned away, leaving nothing but the exhausted reality of a defeated man. He did not speak, he did not attempt to negotiate or offer another hollow apology. He simply reached for the divorce petition and the debt assumption agreement I had left on the counter. I watched him uncap his pen. The only sound in the kitchen was the sharp, rapid scratch of ink against paper. He signed his name on every required line, legally severing our marriage and formally accepting 100% of the fraudulent credit line. He chose financial ruin over a federal penitentiary. It was the only logical calculation left for him to make. He placed the pen down, stood up, and picked up a single leather duffel bag he had packed during the night. He walked out the front door without looking back, relinquishing his claim to my home, my assets, and my life. By noon, the final phase of the extraction commenced. I was working from my home office when a white and green patrol vehicle pulled into my driveway. A county sheriff wearing a crisp uniform and carrying a clipboard walked up the front steps and rang the doorbell. I answered the door, verified my identity as the property owner, and directed him down the hallway toward the guest wing. The sheriff knocked heavily on the guest suite door. Valerie opened it, her face pale and drawn. The officer handed her a formal, court-approved 3-day notice to quit for a commercial eviction. He explained the parameters of the document in a flat, bureaucratic voice, informing her that failure to vacate the premises within 72 hours would result in a physical removal by law enforcement personnel. The reality of the uniformed officers standing in the hallway shattered whatever lingering delusions Valerie and Natalie harbored. The refined, affluent aesthetic they tried so desperately to project dissolved into sheer panic. They spent the next 2 hours frantically scrambling through the guest wing. Lacking proper luggage, they stuffed their designer clothes, expensive cosmetics, and stolen comforts into heavy-duty black plastic garbage bags. They dragged the bags down the driveway, their faces hidden from the curious stares of the neighbors, loading them into the trunk of a rented compact car. They drove away in silence, expelled from the sanctuary they tried to steal. With the physical threat removed, Naomi Vance executed the legal cleanup. She submitted the sworn affidavit of forgery and the surrendered notary commission record directly to the credit union's internal fraud division. Banks are risk-averse institutions. When presented with undeniable proof of a felony forgery facilitated by a corrupt notary, their primary objective is to contain the exposure and avoid federal regulatory scrutiny. The bank moved swiftly to mitigate the scandal. They formally rescinded my liability for the home equity line of credit, scrubbing my name and my property from the debt instrument. They accepted the debt assumption agreement Leo had signed, pinning the entire $150,000 obligation squarely onto his empty pockets. The dark cloud hanging over my deed evaporated, leaving my blind trust entirely unassailable. The domino effect of the severed funds radiated outward, destroying the illusions they had built. Without the stolen equity to subsidize her lifestyle, Natalie's fake event planning boutique filed for bankruptcy within the month. Crescent Holdings collapsed entirely. Valerie, fleeing the mounting pressure of her offshore casino markers, was forced to move into a cramped, low-rent apartment on the opposite side of the state. She traded my vaulted ceilings and quartz countertops for linoleum floors and the constant, suffocating fear of debt collectors. Leo moved into a transient motel, saddled with a 6-figure liability he could never hope to repay, facing a lifetime of wage garnishments and ruined credit. I did not celebrate their ruin. I simply closed their file and turned my attention back to the restoration of my environment. I hired a private contractor to arrive the very next morning. The shrill whine of power drills echoed through the house as every external lock was removed and replaced with heavy-duty solid brass deadbolts. I changed the security system codes and deactivated their access credentials. Next came the painters. A crew of professionals sealed off the guest wing and applied 2 thick coats of premium stain-blocking primer to the walls. The chemical scent of the fresh paint systematically eradicated the stale, cloying stench of Valerie's heavy floral perfume. They finished the room in a crisp, bright white, restoring the space to a blank canvas. The physical footprint of their occupation was wiped clean, replaced by the scent of fresh paint and the pristine quiet of an empty room. On Sunday morning, precisely 1 week after the disastrous dining room tribunal, I woke up to a house flooded with natural sunlight. The ambient tension that had poisoned the air for 2 months was entirely gone. I walked into my kitchen, retrieving a fresh bag of imported dark roast espresso beans. I ground the beans, the rich, complex aroma filling the room, and pulled a perfect shot of espresso. I carried my ceramic mug into the formal dining room and sat down at my grandmother's cherry wood table. The house was profoundly, beautifully quiet. I opened my laptop, awakening the screen to display my personal financial spreadsheet. I updated the cells, pulling the latest balances from my secure, independent accounts. The mortgage was paid. The property taxes were current. The retirement portfolio remained untouched and compounding. I looked at the bottom line, watching the net worth calculate into a precise, undeniable sum. Every single number on that screen belonged to me. I did not secure my future by negotiating with thieves. I did not protect my sanctuary by raising my voice or begging for respect. I protected my life by treating the people who tried to dismantle it like a hostile corporate entity. I found the discrepancy. I traced the money. I froze the assets. I won by auditing the people who tried to steal my life, relying on the cold, unforgiving reality of the ledger. I closed the spreadsheet, folded the screen of my laptop down, and took a slow, deliberate sip of my fresh espresso. I sat back in the antique chair, closed my eyes, and finally enjoyed the quiet.